3, 4, 5.
Please take your seats. Our program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Bliss.
Well, what do I do? I'm not going to speak to the bullets on the assertion slides because that's for you guys. And it doesn't make sense for me to go through that and then turn it.
You sleep well last night?
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually a lot of people's answer.
Second night I slept great.
Oh, really?
First night terribly. Third and fourth night okay.
Okay. Yeah, it is.
Because of the altitude or because of the time change? Yeah. No, it's
Cool. All right, I'm going to
Ladies and
call out
gentlemen,
the sponsors.
please take your seats.
This morning.
Our program is about to begin.
And then a couple other ones.
sure. Yeah. I'll take here. You guys.
Yeah, exactly. Otherwise,
Okay, let's move in, and so we begin our sessions this morning. We wanted to spend just a couple minutes this morning thanking, first of all of you for being here, for being engaged this entire time, for being part of a conversation in this format. And I appreciate so much your involvement and commitment. We also wanted to acknowledge our sponsors, for whom, if without these people, it would have been difficult to sort of pull this off. First, our three convening sponsors: the Lausanne Social Venture Fund. That's the one I'm actually in charge of, so that's my money. The Ion Management Science Lab of Coney are now joint venture partners, and we're so excited about that. And then Strategy Science, who is, of course, providing the outlet for the academic aspects of this effort. We can't. I want to acknowledge both the Office of the President of the University of Utah. It happens that the President of the University of Utah is the former dean of the business school. So Taylor was instrumental in hiring me. And so when I came to Taylor's office, he was very generous, understood the value here. And the dean's office, we have a new dean. So this is actually the old interim dean who is our financial backstop. So, and the new dean, he doesn't have a choice. He has to be that too. So no, he's actually also very supportive. Also, we have a variety of centers in the college. I wanted to mention, we have the Goff Strategic Leadership Center. That's the center that Todd is the academic director of, and their staff is here. They've been very helpful. NYU Stern, thank you. That's a wonderful donation to help us there. The Center for Business, Health, and Prosperity. That's a group on campus that I was associated with, help founding, that focuses on building economic prosperity and health in developing economies primarily. The Sorensen Impact Institute, Matt Higgins is here someplace. He's the academic director of that. That's an organization that supports research and practice on innovation. The Mariner S. Eccles Institute for Quantitative and Market Analysis, QAMO, that's our sister department in the college, Entrepreneurship and Strategy. And then the Center for Innovative, that's the Sorensen Institute for Innovativeness. That's also an organization on campus. Finally, Rotman School, Toronto. Where's Anita? Thank you, Anita. There you go. Thank you. And Said Business School. Oxford. I appreciate those as well. So as you can see, this is a team effort. A lot of people involved that made all this possible, and we're grateful for all their work. Yes, thank you. Very good. Also, I just want you to know that you will be receiving shortly, it'll come out in email today, an evaluation form. We love your feedback about the location, the format, the content, your willingness to, thank you, your willingness to contribute to strategy science, special issues in the book, and those kinds of things. If you could get that back to us, we'd appreciate it, because it's going to help us with the powers that be. So we have to be able to do those things as well. Thank you. As you know, just remind you, we are looking to continue these conversations in written form. And again, to remind you of the strategy science special issues, this information will also go out to you. Really deeply consider thinking about writing papers for those special issues, and or the book that Todd and I will be writing and editing over the next year and a half or so. We will be getting your input into both of those activities. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So thanks for all of you for being here and for all that sort of stuff we had to talk about, but it's very important. But I don't want to take away any more time from this great panel, so go for it. Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Let me first extend my gratitude to Todd and Jay for putting this together. I think this has been a wonderful experience, and I think really important for the field to have these conversations. I also want to thank Todd and Jay for giving us the 7:30 a.m. on the last day slot, because it shows that those of you who are in the room right now, you are dedicated. You think this is an important topic, and so thank you all for being here with us. When I was asked to have this assignment and to put together a panel, Jay and Todd said it would be a good idea to have some more senior scholars and some rising stars, younger stars here. So I'm joined by Vanessa, Olga, and Veet. I'll let you decide which of us are the old people and which of us are the young people on this panel. But it's been a real joy to work with my colleagues here as we've thought about this session. Like many of the other panels, we didn't follow the instructions. We decided that we were not all going to write an individual paper, and we've decided to write one paper together as a team. Unlike some of the other groups, that's still aspirational. So there is not a paper shared from us because we did not write one, but we did work to coordinate on this presentation here at this panel. We also decided to mix it up a little bit. Instead of doing a series of presentations or share the PowerPoint deck here, we're actually going to run this fireside chat style here. So let me advance here. What we're going to do here is we're going to take the main prompt that we have and break it down into 3 separate questions here. And for each question, I'm going to just share some broad thoughts here and then make an assertion and then get reflections from the panelists on that assertion. The last point here that we're going to open up discussion after each question, we're not going to do that. I realized that was a bad idea. So we're going to go through the 3 questions and then open it up to the group here, though we are going to try to leave at least 40 minutes or so to have that conversation. So the 3 sub-questions we want to ask are, first, has strategic management had much to say to date about these grand challenges? The second is really more of a normative question here. Should grand challenges be in the purview of strategic management? And then the third, maybe a more prescriptive question, how can strategic management maybe have more to say about these grand challenges? So before we jump in, I just want to make a couple large observations here. First, this idea of grand challenges is receiving significant global attention and scholarship. People follow the UN sustainability goals. This idea that there are a number of society system level challenges that we face as a global community, whether it's sustainability and climate change, poverty and income inequality, human rights, social justice, global health and pandemic, especially after COVID, being important topics. And really there is a prescription here, right? Like, how do we advance society on these grand challenges? And I would just observe to start off with here is there is a vast literature coming across the sciences, social sciences, engineering, attempting to address these challenges. So this is a big topic that touches upon a lot of different academic areas, and there's a lot of work being dedicated to thinking about how we make progress on these issues. The second thing I would observe is that managers are paying attention and responding to these grand challenges. Now, we can debate whether this is all cheap talk or whether they should be doing this or not, but as a matter of fact, they are doing things, right? We are seeing efforts migrating to the C-suite. We see the appointment of things like chief sustainability officers. We see the publishing of annual reports about their ESG performance. They're setting goals. They're discussing impact. They're working with different groups within kind of their broader stakeholder set here. And of course, especially over the last few years, we've seen this concerted effort in the investment community to think about investing in firms around ESG principles and the like. And again, these things can be contested and there's a lot of debate around them. But as a matter of fact, these things are phenomenon that are happening in the world. So first question, has strategic management had much to say to date about ground challenges? As someone who started work around business and environment issues back in the mid-90s, I'm actually amazed to see the vast growth in the strategy literature on topics related to these kind of bigger questions about kind of social impact and the like. They come from a number of different traditions. Some of us come from a more sustainability tradition. As we talked about 2 days ago, there's a whole stakeholder strategy effort that really goes back 40 years or so. Some of us are also part of the non-market strategy community here. And I would argue we're asking important questions that at least touch upon this idea of grand challenges. You know, under what conditions do firms internalize negative externalities? A lot of work recently about what is material to firms in this ESG space. Again, the whole stakeholder literature. When are stakeholders important? When do they influence firms? There's a whole literature on disclosure. When do firms disclose various performance attributes and the like, and why do they do so? You know, a lot of work on, again, community building, collective action. When do firms coordinate with various stakeholders and the like? And then some deeper philosophical issues, which I'm sure will be part of our discussion today, about organizational purpose and what is the role of businesses in society. So our first assertion is, while there is this vast literature that has developed and strategic management has had something to say, it is maybe not enough if, again, your premise is how do we make progress on these grand challenges? And again, I just point out there's a lot of work across a lot of different academic disciplines trying to address those grand challenges. So I'm not going to run through these bullet points here because we kind of collectively crafted these. And instead, this is the point I'm going to turn to our panelists here to get their reflection. And I guess the first question would be, you know, do you support this assertion? And what are your thoughts? So I'm going to go with Veet first here.
I guess we're starting to reveal who's the senior, you know, who can go back furthest in time. So 30 years ago, when I was starting the PhD program, it's kind of scary. I think it's the first time I could say that. 30 years ago, when I was starting the PhD program, the question about whether you could study multinational firms' interactions with political actors, addressing inequality and inequity in the distribution of electricity or in infrastructure services in emerging markets, whether you could do that in a business school, in a management department, was an open question. Some people are, well, you should be maybe getting a PhD in nonprofit management, or we're not really, like, that's not really a question that we study. And things have changed pretty dramatically. I mean, when I look around this room, when I listen to the conversation on the first day talking about social value, stakeholder theory, it's really impressive how much questions that used to be sort of delegated to philanthropy have become stakeholder strategy, have become strategy even, have become integrated. On the other hand, we were scheduled at 7:30 in the morning on the last day of the conference, and I'm still in an academy session at 3:30 on Tuesday talking about these issues, in which one of the presentations is on Zoom, and one of the presentations was canceled because somebody has a flight. So there's room for progress. I mean, look, you can look at this a lot of ways. Companies are making material investments, percentage points of revenue, percentage points of profit in voluntary efforts to address climate mitigation, to address social justice, to address racial justice. Big investment banks are allocating funds to strategies for the climate transition, for gender empowerment. And so there are vehicles that are attracting trillions of dollars of capital. Alliances are being formed between companies and NGOs to make progress on these things, and many of us in the room are studying those alliances. There are growing arguments that the way we accept that intangibles are important, but we're starting to recognize that part of the key value of intangibles isn't just brand and R&D, it's also relational capital with communities and with stakeholders. So that's all progress. But none of this is lining up with a net zero goal. None of this is coming close to mobilizing $150 trillion of capital, which is going to be required to get to a net zero goal. None of this is coming close to addressing social injustice, either in the United States with historic discrimination or against immigrant communities in Europe, racial identity groups across Africa. Businesses arguably are often making identity group conflict worse rather than better through their investments, which is destabilizing support for capitalism, contributing to the rise of populism, threatening the post-war economic order. How are we doing on the SDGs? I mean, so if we're really serious about our firms contributing to addressing the grand challenges, that's not as much an open question. We're addressing the topics of the grand challenges, but we're doing it from a firm-centered standpoint. So yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
Great, thank you. Let me go with Olga, since you're on the end there.
So thank you for inviting us all here. I don't want to repeat everybody, but it's been great, and it's great to be here at 7:30 a.m. in the morning. So for those who don't know me, I've been teaching sustainability strategy to MBA students for now almost 10 years. So a lot of my comments will be coming from that experience, and I just want to share one data point. In the last 2 years, so it's a strategy course. It's part of core now, actually, a core elective still, but it's a core class. But what I've noticed, so they have this final project that they have to do, and of course, as any strategy final project, it's like a consulting project. They have to find a leader and a laggard in sustainability in one industry. And what I've noticed in the last 2 years or so, it's really hard to find a laggard. So this shows you the progress. And of course, they pick public firms, those that publish the reports, and they can collect information. But that also shows you how far has business advanced in addressing these challenges. Moreover, when they pick two companies, it's very hard for them to now pick a leader too, because they cover different areas. There's a lot more competition and which issues they go after, what solutions they provide. And so I just wanted to share that experience with you. The other class I teach is a global immersion elective. And so we actually, with sustainability and social enterprise theme, and so we travel with 25 MBA students around the world, visiting companies that do this kind of work. So literally seeing in practice how different companies address these grand challenges. And in terms of research, now let's go back to the actual question. Well, no, actually, let me share one story. So when we were in Zimbabwe last May, we visited this one startup. And you would appreciate it, 3 young white Zimbabweans who traveled the world, came back home to address a grand challenge. And the challenge that they picked was very personal to them. So one of the founders of the startup, it's called LA Collection, his dad was attacked by an elephant out of the blue. This is Africa. There comes an elephant, and of course, it's very dangerous. But why is this happening? Because of plastic pollution. So elephants go to, the waste dumps, eat whatever they can find. And so there are also, as you have images of birds with their stomachs open and a lot of plastic inside, so you have the same images now, viral images of elephants. And so as they consume this plastic waste, the toxins affect their body, they become crazy, and then they attack human beings. And so this human-animal wild conflict is a grand challenge. But the solution that they found is very innovative, right? So what they did, they adopted this new technology. So one of them was in the construction industry. The other one was an MBA student who had, the toolkit that maybe some of you even taught him. And then the third one had the connection to this innovative technology. But so what they do, they actually hire women, which is also addressing another grand challenge, who are living in poverty, don't have opportunities, who walk around and collect this plastic waste for them, bring it to a site where they actually make concrete mixed with this plastic waste material that's much stronger to build with and withstands, any sort of challenges that they have on the ground. And so it's addressing several problems, which kind of demonstrates to you grand challenges are complex, multi-level. They require innovative solutions that essentially require public actors, private actors, society to get on board. Sorry. And so this is just another example, I guess, from practice. But now back to research that has strategic management had enough to say. I do think that, there is, again, looking us in this room, looking at our work, people's work in this room, there has been a lot of progress. But given that, I coordinated a special issue on grand challenges and responsible innovation in JMS, I know Rajri has a special issue in SMJ on sort of, say, similar topics, right? Innovative solutions to these challenges. That points to me that there is not enough, right? That we still want, and because there's special issue, there's still a special call to address them. So I do agree with this statement.
Vanessa?
Thanks. Thanks so much to the organizers, Todd, Jay, for having us. This has been really fantastic. I want to say, so I agree, with Olga, there's been this increasing demand, I think, for these types of topics from our stakeholders, if you think about it. There's been a surge in just interest from the MBA students, executives on these types of issues. And I also agree with Veet in this characterization of sort of this having evolved in my slightly shorter career than Veet's, having seen an evolution in terms of sort of the acceptance and interest in these types of topics. But I would really characterize the existing strategic management research as sort of adjacent to, as opposed to really saying something about these issues. And, the reason for that, I think, is that a lot of our research on, say, corporate social responsibility, for example, has been existing under this premise of we need to figure out whether or not this can be win-win. Can firms do well by doing good? What are the conditions under which firms can be more financially successful, whether it be via employee motivation or other stakeholder behavior, if they engage in these types of activities that may also do something about the grand challenges in sort of an indirect way. But I think there's two sort of aspects of this doing well by doing good kind of emphasis that have limited what we've really been able to say so far. One part of it has to do with the doing well aspect. I would argue that to really make progress on some of these grand challenges, it is probably going to be necessary for firms and individuals to sort of be willing to do things that are kind of against what their immediate short-term self-interest might look like. And so when we're framing these things as sort of under what conditions can we do well, I think we're bounding a little bit what we can say there. The other aspect is this doing good part of the phrase, doing well by doing good. I would argue that most of the CSR research or most of the research in strategy journals that has invoked that phrase has not actually looked at whether any of these programs actually do good. My own research included. We take assume or take for granted that maybe these corporate philanthropy programs or other types of initiatives that we're examining whether they influence firm performance, we take for granted that they're doing good. When in fact, there's research out there, maybe in other fields, that suggests that sometimes there can be unintended consequences of these types of things. So what if these programs actually have zero impact on society, or maybe even negative impact on society? And I think we haven't gone there yet. And so I would personally characterize the research that we are seeing. It's exciting to see kind of this increase in engagement on these topics, but I would characterize our research so far as sort of adjacent to, but not really addressing directly the grand challenges.
Can I add something? I just remembered looking at Alfonso. I still remember when you told me about 6 years ago how you were decomposing SMJ submissions, and a third of them already at that time was on CSR and these kinds of topics, just again to put it into perspective.
So that goes to my next question, and be provocative. Is this a good thing? Is this a good thing that all of this work has now proliferated in the strategy world? And so this question, should grand challenges be in the purview of strategic management? And let me just try to frame the counter for why this maybe shouldn't be something we should be focused on here. There are, of course, these classic assertions that we all know very well, that the firm purpose should be to limit limited pursuit of stakeholder value maximization. And this, of course, is often attributed to Milton Friedman, but others have obviously made this argument over the years. To be clear, this is a normative argument that he was making. It was an argument he was making in the 1960s when there were a number of firms originally thinking about pursuing corporate social responsibility. And he was making the argument firms should actually, for the best of society, have this limited purview of pursuit of shareholder value. I would also observe there were two very important conditionals on that again, sometimes are lost through history here. One was that the companies should obey the rule of law. Like that is required of them. You can't pursue profit if you're going to violate the law. And there's an assumption there about exogeneity of institutions. So for those of us who are in the non-market world, we know that's not true, right? That companies are actively shaping their institutional environment. They're actively influencing the political process. They're lobbying. They're trying to set regulation and rules. And so the normative argument starts to fall apart when we endogenize institutions. The second piece is about endogeneity of preferences, which is something I don't think we talk enough about in economics and in strategy, which is there's a presumption here that we have utility and firms are responding to consumer and other stakeholder utility. But let's be honest, companies are actively shaping our utility function. They're spending lots of money at Google to try to nudge you and have certain preferences and the like. How does that change the whole equation when this occurs? I would observe there also been some recent critiques of all of this, efforts by companies and the like, in the research as well, that largely frames this as agency issues. And I think that's a really interesting and important question. When we see companies going out and pursuing social objectives, is this really just an agency issue where they're imposing their political and moral beliefs in ways that maybe don't satisfy other stakeholders, especially their shareholders? Or are there some power dynamics within the organization, like middle managers and the like, who are asserting influence in ways that are actually destructive to firm value creation? And then the last point is just one that we've talked quite a bit about over the last few days, which is, what are the bounds of our field? And I would argue that, if you take a very traditional, narrow view of strategic management as exclusively concerned with the securing of supernormal profits, maybe then you would argue that, there's not a lot of us, not much interesting that we can say in strategy about ground challenges, and we should therefore ignore it. So I'm going to give you a shocking assertion here, given our panel. We think it should absolutely be in the purview of strategic management. So I know that is going to be shocking here. But with that, let me go back to the panel. And Vanessa, I'm going to go with you first here. So do you agree with this assertion? And if so, why should this be an important part of our work?
So yes, but with nuance. Yes, with a caveat. I think there's aspects of our field that make us well poised potentially to say something about these issues. And I mean, I personally care about these issues and would love to be doing research that I feel like has something to say about and moves the needle on these types of things. But there's sort of just two caveats or kind of cautions that I want to bring up when I think about I myself potentially doing more of this and maybe others doing more of this as well. And one is something that came up earlier in the conference, which is the fact that, in the realm of grand challenges, we are talking about issues that societies do not agree on in a lot of ways. And so, not only do they not agree on some of these issues, there are groups of people who have sort of polarized, completely opposite opinions on what the problems are and what the appropriate solutions are to those problems. And to make it even more complicated, these are sets of issues about which polarization of opinion has been shifting over time. There was a time, I think maybe many years ago, where nobody really would have thought of climate change issues as sort of being politicized. Nowadays, they are very politicized. Same with sort of DEI issues. And so we're seeing sort of a shift in opinion over time about these opinions as well. And I think that's sort of very different, I think, from when you think about our current focus in strategic management as when we think about helping managers address their problems and challenges. Because generally speaking, better firm performance, good. More motivated employees, good. So there's been generally more agreement on the types of problems and challenges that we've sort of been trying to help managers address so far. And I think this characterization as being distinct is just important to bring up. The other caveat or caution that I wanted to sort of bring up to this room is that I think it's also important that we not be viewed as normative or as pushing a particular agenda, because I think that can harm perceptions of the reliability in and the truth in behind the research that we do. And so I'll share sort of a personal anecdote related to how I think about this. So I have a paper that was published in Management Science in 2021 that looked at how employees respond to employers taking stances on social political issues like LGBTQ rights related issues, for example. And ran a field experiment. I found in this study that employees who disagreed with the stance that was communicated by their employer were demotivated, but I found no such motivating effect if they agreed with the stance that their employer was sharing. And so, I ran this study in 2018. This was one of the earlier papers or studies looking at this topic. And I remember at the time, especially early on when I would present this at conferences, I remember feeling like a lot of people in the CSR community really hated this paper. They really disliked this finding. And people would come up to me after presentations and say, this is one of the earliest papers on the topic. You're saying it's one of the sort of first revealed preference causal papers on the topic. Do you really want to put a paper out there that will cause CEOs to conclude that maybe they shouldn't be opining on issues like LGBTQ rights? And I went back, I quintuple checked all my analyses. I was like, surely I miscoded a variable. The finding was what the finding was. And looking back on that, I think it was actually perhaps even more important that I published that paper because it found something that I hadn't expected to find, and pre-registered, by the way, and in a lot of ways, which sort of went against what I might personally have ideologically been hoping to find there. So, these are just two things I think that are important to keep in mind. Does that mean that I think we shouldn't be doing research on these topics? Absolutely not. But I think that, we have to be careful about how we do it. And, tone, framing, wording in a paper, I think can make all the difference between being perceived as sort of pushing a particular agenda, as opposed to having something important and interesting to say about an important topic.
Thank you for that. I just want to make another anecdote. Andy King's my work on industry self-regulation had similar reactions from those who are like, "Oh, you're doubting this thing that we think is going to be the solution here." And I think that idea of we're not, we have to be scientists here is really important. Let me go with Olga, and then we'll get to you.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with Vanessa. As much as I would like for my work to show more positive effects, a lot of it is showing negative effects. But yes, I look at it as this is science and this is what it shows, and this is also important, relevant, and useful to managers to know, right? But in terms of going back to, we're trying to be provocative. Costas here was talking about how we do generate the relevant insights, but maybe none of them are useful. I would assert this statement that grand challenges absolutely should be in the purview of strategic management because helping managers think through how to address them would be very useful, right? And not just for managers, but also for society. But I want to go to the last point on this, the bullet, because this kind of came from, again, from teaching, thinking about this hard and how strategy as a science is truly the only science, I believe, that can actually help managers think through these issues. So think about it. All we're trying to explain, right, is under what conditions X, improves Y. Y is usually firm performance. It's all about heterogeneity. It's all about understanding who wins and why. And so even applying that frame, there are many solutions, but we actually already could predict which of them would have the best answer because of ecosystems, right? Because maybe of funding, right? Because of those startups, entrepreneurs behind them, their founder identity. We have so much to say that we already actually could predict which of these emerging solutions, and there are a lot, right? Which of them will take off and which, going back to industry evolution, a lot of people in this room study that, and which of them will fail and why do they fail? And how can we, how can we address those factors so they don't fail, right? If they have better solutions and incorporating out the science. We also look at these trade-offs, right? This is essentially what strategy is all about. So that's why I talk about, sustainability strategy is a strategy course, because as much as, I'd love for it not to be a trade-off, there is still a cost assigned to any of those solutions, right? And so you have to weigh that in against the benefits. And maybe, strategy also looks around, we incorporate institutions, we incorporate countries, right? We incorporate multiple levels of analysis, and that also helps us find more benefits across all of those different levels, which other sciences may not do, they may disregard. Interdependencies, oh my God, talk about that, right? A lot of these grand challenges have a lot of, unintended consequences, as well as, many firms are just not doing anything. And so practitioners want to know what is the cost of inaction and what are the potential consequences of these unintended consequences before they make these decisions. And again, I think we have a lot to say. We actually have those answers, we just haven't applied them to these challenges, to the grand challenges yet. Also, strategy is all about setting simple, long-term goals, right? This is kind of the core definition of what it is. And with sustainability, with grand challenges, you have to do that. You have to incorporate those goals into your operations. You have to integrate them functionally inside the organization in order for them to be achieved. You have to, have incentives. And again, we know this, but many people do not. And finally, I want to go back to, the core tenet, I guess, of strategy, right? We also know that resources and capabilities are core to achieving any goals that companies would set, right? And so that also helps, I think, to start, like many nonprofits don't even think about that. I mean, they're under-resourced, they know this, right? But what capabilities do they need to develop? How to develop, make, buy, borrow, or collaborate, right? Like those decisions, again, we have answers to that that many do not. Thank you.
Thank you. Pete?
I totally agree with everything that's been said. I guess I'm going to tackle this, build on this a little bit from a personal perspective. For the last 2 years, I've been the vice dean of the ESG initiative at the Wharton School. So I thought about the strategy of the Wharton School on ESG. And there's some stakeholders of the Wharton School who you might imagine, alumni, board members, who question whether we should have an ESG strategy. And so I've thought a lot about how to present the case that, yes, we should have a strategy. One piece of evidence that I couldn't point to then, but I can point to now, is we launched a major. In the first year that it was available, it was the 6th most popular major at the Wharton School, and it's on track to be the 4th most popular in the second year. So there's demand. So if we just say, should we be addressing this as a business school? Yes, it's a good strategy. I also face a lot of these critiques of, isn't this just middle managers or CEOs run amok? Don't we just need to control this? Shouldn't we just be focused on business? And I think this is a place where you need to push back and say, look, it's hard to understand the logic that the reason firms are engaging on DEI, the reason firms are engaging on the climate transition, is because of unconstrained middle managers. Relative to maybe extreme heat, extreme storms, racial riots, immigration riots in the UK, maybe businesses are responding to signs that the system is under stress and is fragile on some of these issues. And maybe that's what's really driving corporate responses. And if we're training the managers who are going out and deciding how much to invest in pollution control versus pollution, discrimination in their hiring and pay versus allyship and mentorship and other programs that overcome social injustice in the workforce, sourcing from the lowest cost supplier without regards to human rights or child labor, or responsible sourcing, corporate political activity to drive tax rates down to 0 versus anything else, engaging with discourse with stakeholders versus ignoring them, maybe we should be part of that conversation, because these systemic level consequences of business decisions, right? Where does the pollution come from? Where does the discrimination come from? Where does the inequality come from? It comes from the decisions of managers about who to pay, who to hire, who to source from, where to build, how to engage with the government. So businesses are a central actor in these system level challenges that we're facing. There's just no lane in which business operates in which it doesn't affect the grand challenges. So the idea that business should stay in its lane, well, what it makes, who it hires, what it sources from is affecting these outcomes. So there isn't a lane without the grand challenges. And it's also interesting to look at the historical efforts in the past to just focus this in on the control of managerial agency. I mean, we've gone through this period, right? Let's go back and reach Schumpeter and think about the early part of the century, and let's look back at how well the efforts to just focus on managerial pay and incentives went. Did that really create a better functioning capitalist system, or maybe one that was more volatile, had more crises, was more fragile, and now has more populism, and also has more externalities in the forms of grand challenges? I think there's a real logic to be bringing business in. And then why strategic management? And I think this is something that we've all touched on a lot. Addressing this is going to take collective action across sectors. It's going to take addressing ideological differences of opinion about how serious these things are and what are the causal mechanisms behind them. This is certainly a case of Knightian uncertainty. It's going to require massive innovation across ecosystems. This is what we do. There's demand. Business is centrally implicated, and we have exactly the sets of tools and skills in terms of what we study and how we study to make progress on them. So let's go.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to get to the last question here, and then hopefully we can have a more kind of wide-ranging discussion here. So our last question was, how can strategic management have more to say about grand challenges? And I want to help frame this by an anecdote. Given the work I do on kind of environmental policy and the like, I get involved at different panels and the like. And I was on one with two other more traditional environmental economists, environmental policy scholars. And when it came to climate change and decarbonization, they only have one answer. And that answer is put a price on carbon. And there have been 30 years of research in economics debating whether a cap and trade system versus a carbon tax is more economically efficient. And it was great. It was a 5-minute conversation with them. And I look at the world as far more complex and interesting than that. You think about R&D policy. You think about now this kind of rise of industrial policy. We're going to talk about that at the next panel here. Antitrust, does that relate to issues here of how we make progress on these issues? Taxation, you can keep going down the list. I think strategy scholars, because of our willingness to maybe relax some of the traditional assumptions, and especially economics, has a unique lens on these issues that other voices out there talking about policy, talking about what actions need to be taken, just simply do not have the mechanisms to really talk about these things. So I highlight a few on here. Obviously our focus on imperfect markets here, the ability to create economic rents, focusing on competitive positioning as a very important and interesting phenomenon to be studied and understood. Competition versus cooperation, the complex dynamics across landscapes, those of us are interested in interdependency and the like. Obviously, our willingness to even ask the question, could there be other incentives motivating managerial and firm action beyond just the profit motive? That's an interesting and important question here. And then, for those of us interested in innovation and change, just understanding the dynamics of markets, understanding the role that things like search play, endogenous innovation, technology disruptions, market disequilibrium, those are natural to this community of scholars, and dare I say, are not natural to a lot of other allied social sciences. So to turn to the group here, I think the assertion becomes strategy scholars have a unique opportunity actually to address grand challenges, but it might require some shifts in the way we think about who we are and what we do. I had you first last time, right? So I'm gonna go with Olga to start this time.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I would have to be honest. I was a little disappointed with day one, redefining the DV or units of analysis or levels of analysis or what strategic management is about. And I know some of the more junior faculty in this room also shaking their heads in a yes, because I expect that we will be talking about this social impact, social environmental performance as a new DV that we need to expand as a part of that firm performance. It's not just financial, but it's also all these other types of performance, right, that firms are engaged in and we cannot ignore anymore. So I'd like, I think, to push us to be provocative, to think about that as a DV. Also, I think, we need to think more about even, and I think we already see this in SMS and what's happening. Is Mark Desjardins in the room, by the way? He just got SMS Emerging Scholar Award, and he is now second after Vanessa, after, Ronnie, Mike, and others, John Bundy, who are on that list of, highly selected list of scholars who are contributing to this area of research and are now becoming, again, significant, I think, symbols of the movement. But yes, I think systems level thinking and systems modeling is what we actually have done before. So again, looking at those interdependencies, NK landscape, whatever it is, but you really can model some of these challenges and solutions and different actors using that method. More qualitative studies, of course, always help to dig deeper. And we see a lot of them being published in AMJ, I think. That's another one I will call out. But I want to leave you with some points too, so shut up now.
let me go to Veet, and then we'll get to you, Vanessa.
So yeah, I think there's easy low-hanging fruit that we could do, and then I agree. There's harder and there's research that's going to require change. It's going to require advancement. So I mean, some of the easy work, when we're studying strategic implementation and why firms struggle to make some challenges, some choices. I mean, let's study climate mitigation. Let's study social justice issues. Let's bring that into the purview of the strategic change initiatives we're looking at and the implementation. You know, we're looking, rugged landscapes is a great idea. I mean, these are complex, interdependent factors. Let's look at that in the way that firms are making the choices. On the social impact question, I think, you know, there was a great discussion in the last session yesterday about what should the DV be and what role does firm value play? And I can imagine there being pushback on the DV being social value. But let's keep working through the causal chain. The firm creates negative externalities, right? Those negative externalities are affecting stakeholders. They're affecting people in the community. They're affecting customers. They're affecting next generations. They're affecting people downstream. They're affecting people who are impacted by the climate crisis. Those people rise up and either protest, demand regulatory change, demand new policies, shift their products and of consumption. They demand change. When that happens, it hits firm value. So let's start working through that causal chain. There's not, I mean, this is a real problem in the regulatory environment. We talk about social impact or societal materiality in the EU versus financial materiality. They're not orthogonal, they're linked. And we're well placed to look at that linkage. When we're studying collective action and systems and non-market strategy, I mean, let's be doing it in this area. So I think there's low-hanging fruit. But would any of this really help us distinguish between a firm that's making profits in tar sands versus green energy, tobacco or palm oil versus sustainable agriculture, online gambling versus financial inclusion, male baldness drugs or versus malaria, dengue, or West Nile, which is now endemic in Texas? Someone who's making profits by avoiding pollution control devices versus producing electric vehicles and sustainable aviation fuel. I mean, where do we start drawing the line between different types of profits and business models which are based on imposing externalities on others versus those that are not doing the same? I mean, that's going to require change. And these problems go beyond the simple Ostrom models of tragedies of the commons. They go beyond social mobilization or social movement literature. It's going to require more change. And let me just point to a couple changes that are going to be required. There's a lot of exciting work going in stakeholder theory, and we heard about that yesterday. But even the discussion we had yesterday, and a lot of the discussion going on around how we expand stakeholder theory to be more firm-centered, think about who's in and who's out, it's still firm-centered. We're not talking about a system of stakeholders that are choosing which firms to engage with, which firms to engage in conflict with. We're not changing the locus of energy. When we start the conversation of who's in and who's out on an individual firm, we're not looking at a system of heterogeneous stakeholders who vary in their ideology, who are making decisions about which firms to contribute to, which firms not, and how much. And so stakeholder theory needs to expand to more of a system-level perspective. Similarly, non-market strategy. It's great that we're starting, and there's more exciting work around non-market strategy, but are we looking at the industry associations, the PACs that are lobbying against climate change? Are we calling out firms that say one thing in their sustainability efforts and do the opposite in terms of their political lobbying? Are we thinking about non-market strategy as part of the overall corporate strategy, the consistency, the alignment there, and also the industry level and cross-industry partnerships that are often blocking progress on some of these grand challenges? The common theme here is more system-level thinking, more movement away from narrow, solely firm-centered focus, but always bringing it back to firm value in the long term. That's going to require thinking about ecosystems, pragmatic problem solving. The next panel on industrial policy, we're definitely going to need better policies to nudge corporations. I mean, the best way we're going to get ESG investing in corporations to address the climate transition is carbon tax would be first, but the next would be more subsidies, more taxes like the IRA, like the EU policies. So we need those nudges as well to drive change. So we have to be thinking about this at a system level, and I think there's real opportunities to do that.
Just a quick aside here for those of us who teach non-market strategy. I sometimes feel like it's like Harry Potter and Defense Against the Dark Arts. You can't teach Defense Against the Dark Arts without teaching the dark arts, right? So if you're talking about corporate influence on political institutions and social institutions, that can be used depending on whatever values you have for good or for evil. And we just have to recognize that does happen. There's interesting behavior by firms who are actively working against these, and we can ask why they're doing that and what their motivation is. But that's a reality.
And maybe expose them.
All right, Vanessa.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think certainly thinking about what we might need to change or see more of, I mean, I think it's all of the conversations that we've had in this conference up till now are so related to whether or not we can really sort of make this shift and have more to say about grand challenges. I mean, as was mentioned, we would really have to embrace research at all levels of analysis, from the very, very micro to sort of the even more macro, more systems level than we've been thinking about so far. We need to really embrace social outcomes as DVs of interest to our community. I want to emphasize that social outcomes as DVs is much easier said than done, because we would need reliable, accurate measures of what social outcomes are that there's some sort of agreement on as well. And I would argue that that doesn't really exist yet. And so that would probably require us to do, related to another one of the past panels, engaging more with policy and practitioners. We would probably, to generate these types of measures and come to agreement about what they are, we would probably have to be engaging more, collaborating more directly with practitioners, with private rating agencies, with natural scientists and individuals in other disciplines. The second thing that I'll emphasize is that I think if we want to really move the needle on grand challenges, one of the things that we have to sort of grapple with is the fact that you can, as you're making progress in one, you can often be doing harm in another. And that is just sort of a trade-off that I think is really hard to tackle. Perhaps in some ways it's an opportunity for us strategy scholars, because we do a lot in terms of sort of thinking about and conceptualizing trade-offs. And then lastly, I just wanted to emphasize that, I think incentives and signals for researchers, especially junior researchers, are really important. And so, is this something that we think that people should just do after they get tenure and become full professors? Or is this something that we really think that junior researchers in strategy should be focusing on as well? And if that's the case, then I would argue that this research we would need to feel really has a place to be published in our top journals, and not just as sort of one special issue, right? So I would love to hear as during the audience comments from the different editors in the room and their take on whether, papers focused on addressing grand challenges would be perceived as a fit in their journal, and what might make a paper focused on the grand challenges to be a fit in one of their top journals.
Thank you all for that. I just want to comment a little bit on the idea of like systems thinking and the systems perspective, which I think we can bring. In full disclosure, I have 2 degrees in systems engineering, and my PhD was technically in MIT's engineering systems division. So this obviously resonates with me. But to put it on a more personal level, as I think about my research trajectory, I think like a lot of people in this space, I started thinking about internalization of negative externalities, typically of large corporate entities. Right? So when is a large corporation going to start thinking about these issues and make changes? And a big change for me was when I joined UVA, and I started to think about market transitions and technological disruptions and the like. And it's a different perspective, right? Because then you're talking about a system level, like what causes these types of transitions. To be provocative, when I look at a company like ExxonMobil, I don't expect ExxonMobil to become a renewable energy company. That seems ridiculous to me that you would suggest so. To do my best Dr. Evil impression, what I want ExxonMobil to do is to die. And let's be very honest, and I really, this is important, ExxonMobil's not gonna die. They're gonna be around for a long time. And by the way, that's a good thing. Our economy is basically based on fossil fuels right now. So if they disappeared tomorrow and all fossil fuels disappeared tomorrow, we'd be in a lot of trouble as a society, unless we can develop these alternatives. So this idea of how do we think of markets and firms as a system? What role do the political institutions and social institutions play in moving these institutions, all of them, towards these solutions to deal with these types of grand challenges? That's really been the motivation for my work more recently. And I would make the argument that the firm is still central and critical to that discussion. And again, I just want to make the plea that I think as scholars, our sophistication in understanding that core agent, the firm, is what gives us an opportunity to have voice in these larger discussions. I am continually shocked and amazed at the simplicity at which political scientists, sociologists, economists think about the firm and how the firm behaves there. So with that, let me open it up to the room. And I'm actually going to do a cold call because we didn't do our assignment and write a paper, but Dan did write a paper and submit it on the platform there. So Dan, I wanted to give you, I know this is truly a cold call, but do you have any thoughts here since you shared something with us here?
So full disclosure, it was me, Juan.
Okay.
Myself and Tara Ghani called to submit something. And let me, I think our framing, hold on.
Okay, let's get your mic.
Our framing builds a lot on what Veet started out by saying, that there is a lot of voluntary activity going on here, but it's not nearly enough to meet the magnitude of the challenges. And so maybe I should keep standing. The joke I have is that there are these two books, what Harvard Business School teaches you and what Harvard Business School doesn't teach you. And put them together and you know everything that you could possibly need to know. Because, but when it comes to the grand social challenges, our mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive category system is we can address those either through voluntary means or mandatory means and regulation. When it comes to the voluntary side, what the research that Olga, Vanessa, and others are doing are telling us about what the limits are to what voluntary activity in this sector will be. And we need a lot more of that work. We also need it to be disseminated in a way that Vanessa addresses your critique that we can do well by doing good, but we can't get all the way to the end goal by relying on that mechanism. And so one of our unique capabilities is by articulating what we can do, and to one of Anina's points, not getting captured with false trade-offs, but understanding what the true trade-offs are between some of these social objectives and private objectives are. And then on the mandatory side, to a lot of what you were saying, Mike, policymakers don't understand how firms are going to react to different policy choices. There are lots of examples of unintended consequences of policy, and we can help them understand how firms will interpret, react, game, and address the mandatory regulations that come in to try to address these grand social challenges. So our call was to establish our credibility as people can help policymakers understand the mandatory possibilities, the menu of options, and how they'll be reacted to, get some realistic assumptions about what the market will do on its own, so our policymakers aren't crowding out that good, innovative behavior, and continue to kind of push on how we understand the limits of what we'll get through voluntary firm behavior on its own.
Thank you for that. Let's get a couple more comments and then have the panelists respond there. I think Todd's got it.
How wonderful to have this panel, and I'm just so thrilled, and yes, 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 although I disagree, Veet, with your point about firm centricity, and I'll try to make a couple of remarks on that. Sarah, and of course I'm terribly biased, but Sarah has this incredibly great book on the 360 Corporation in which she talks about how for sure we should do well by doing good if we can, but that's low-hanging fruit. I mean, if you're not already doing as well as you can by doing good, then you're not on the frontier. You're not, as a company, you're not maximizing your profit. The really hard thing is to innovate, to do well, to create new value through stakeholder true engagement, taking into account the diversity of stakeholder needs and the fact that many stakeholders don't know what can be accomplished in collaboration with firms. Our paper, this is Leo, and my paper with Tomasz here, two junior scholars who are committed to this agenda, among many others in the room, is about how companies innovate collaboratively with stakeholders to discover and create new value that wasn't previously conceptualized. So doing well by doing good, that phrase to me can be co-option of the true opportunity through innovative stakeholder work by the industrial in the industrial mindset that Mike has written about in this great book he did with Rebecca Duff that I want to just mention briefly in a moment. I want to tell you, I have so much to say about this that I need to be careful. So please keep me honest here, Mike, but I want to make 3 quick points. The first is that about 10 years ago, I said to my dean, I can't teach Coke Pepsi anymore. I can't teach my students how to sell more Doritos. I can't do it. I need to, I don't know anything about male pattern baldness or something that you raised here, but I need to be thinking about the big value creating opportunities of this century, which are the grand challenges, and there are for sure trade-offs among the grand challenges, and we need to get our heads around that, and we need to teach our students to be strategic about that, because as Olga said, there are trade-offs there, and we need to fix that. He said, do it in the core. So he wanted me to teach in the core. And so I said, if I could do that in the core, then I'll teach the core. And so that's what I did here. When I ran for AOM president, I ran on a platform that business schools need to take on the role of grand challenges. And I was for sure certain I was going to lose, because it was such an anti-business school platform in that context. And I was shocked when I won. Apparently, people agree with this idea that there's a lot of opportunity there. Complicit in this idea that strategy and that firms can, I believe that business is the engine of prosperity. I believe that it's also the engine of peril. I believe that firms are tools for getting things done. I believe that firms, when they're established, are choices that stakeholder groups make to deploy resources under a particular organizational form. And I'm thrilled to be working with Professor Barney on a new paper in which we explore the evolution of the purpose of the firm as stakeholder groups, either within an organization or not within an organization, choose to try to use corporate forms to get important things done. So there's where I'm a little bit different place than you, Veet, and thrilled to continue that conversation. And then finally, I wanted to just say a word of purpose. I've learned so much from Claudine about this and from all of you here. I see the expression of firm purpose as the firm's theory of impact on grand challenges agenda. And I want to say that these theories can be enormously threatening to established firms. Mike, your book with Rebecca, which I had the honor of reviewing for ASQ, and it's a great book. It's called The Decarbonization Imperative. Mike goes through sector by sector and describes how threatening this innovation agenda is to the established firms on a kind of innovator's dilemma kind of framework. I recommend this book to you. Is Asim here? Where is Asim? This is not a dance party. People don't like this. It threatens their profitability. It's a huge threat. And so stakeholderism is really about movements. It's about creating the energy to try to overcome this resistance. So thrilled to be here and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Let's take one more and then we'll go back to the panel here.
All right, great. Thanks. Lamar Pierce, Washington University. So one of the things I love about your conversation here is I think you've sort of dived into this idea of the value at the margin, because I think this big question around, should we take on grand challenges needs to be thought of in a different way, which is around where should we be investing our research into around this topic? And let me give you an analogy on this and why this is important. So we know that research on lymphoma and breast cancer are very, very important. But what we also know is we are spending too much on research on those relative to research on breast cancer, or on colorectal cancer, and on lung cancer. And we know what the mortality implications of that are. They're all important to spend money on, just like many, many grand challenges are important to focus on. but where should we be investing the marginal research into these things? And I think in this context, one of my concerns that I've seen is that particularly in China, you have tons of money being pumped in, particularly by the central government, into research on green innovation. And so one thing I'd love your thoughts on are, where are we putting too much research in at the margin relative to others? Because one of my pet peeves is we do very, very few studies on organizations in underrepresented and developing contexts. And I think we tend to do too little of these things because they don't feel like grand challenges. They don't feel like saving the world. But yet then again, if we have a study on organizations that improves efficiency in healthcare clinics in the DRC by 10%, that is a massive benefit. And so I'd love for all of you to discuss sort of where you think we're actually focusing too much on relative to other things, and how we might sort of encourage authors to rebalance that.
So I'm going to take that one if it's okay, my moderator prerogative here. I think, Lamar, the question of does it pay to be green or does it pay to be socially responsible? Any younger Scott, please don't do that work. It is the wrong question. Andy King and I wrote about this in Management Science in 2001, and I'm shocked that we're still asking these questions. And lots of us in this room have written papers with titles of that ilk. We're far enough along to know that there is no way we could agree with the idea that there is never an investment that you could make that has social value that does not have profit. But similarly, and equally important, it cannot be the case that every investment a firm makes in social value has positive personal gain or profitable gain to it. And so the framing of the question to me has been wrong for a long time. And I go to the academy and I still see paper after paper that's kind of asking this, is there a private incentive to do X, Y, Z? We need a much more sophisticated understanding of kind of the creation and change of value, share of value, coordination, and the like, kind of the systems perspective we're arguing for here. But let me turn to others here of how they might want to respond to some of these. Vanessa?
Could I add to that? So to Lamar's question, I think it's exciting to think about sort of what our competitive advantage is as sort of a discipline, or even as individual researchers, and trying to sort of figure out, where can you have the biggest impact on these types of things. And I think there's innovation scholars that I think it makes sense that they would maybe focus on that aspect of things. And then I think maybe there's a role to play in sort of bringing our understanding of sort of how you organize, motivate, and manage people of heterogeneous preferences and types, just as we do in a firm, to try to sort of bring that learning to these really complex systems and collaborations that we're going to have to be talking about. I'll share sort of a personal anecdote about this. So I'm involved, I'm the corporate engagement director. I'm on the executive committee for NSF Science Technology Center focused on improving climate estimates through AI to try to sort of democratize access to improved climate estimates, essentially. And we had big plans about all the collaborative interdisciplinary research that we were going to do with the engineers and the scientists, and myself as a business school person, the social worker on the team. It is much easier to say, let's do cross-disciplinary research than I've discovered it is in practice. I mean, we just use different terms to talk about these things. The way that we think about these things is so different. And one of the things that I've just been kind of interested to find is I feel like one of the biggest ways that I've had impact on this center has actually been to bring some of the learnings from all of our research on organization culture, management of complex entities, to bear to sort of the governance structure of this entity. And so now actually the NSF has basically asked us to write a paper on our learnings about governance of these complex sort of NSF centers. And so to me, this is just, this highlighted, if I think about what our competitive advantage is as a field, maybe it is about things like our learnings about how to motivate people, how to organize people, things like governance and culture. That's kind of a unique aspect that we could bring to these really complex sort of organizations and issues that we're going to be dealing with.
Thank you. Veet?
Yeah, just really quickly, great questions also. So starting with Dan, I think it's important to recognize that when we're thinking about engagement on politically polarized issues, yes, firms may come out behind by engaging, but the world is becoming more polarized. So they may have fewer and fewer choices, and we may be talking about how to minimize losses rather than create victories. And I think that's important. So what's the counterfactual when we're looking at engagement? On crowding out, is voluntary activity crowding out government regulation? I would argue that voluntary efforts to push for more disclosure, to push for more transparency, to get more data is creating the data set that the government is going to look to define good policy. So they're not, again, it's not an orthogonal or a choice. We need more push on corporations to disclose so we can have better policies. And again, I think that's an important shift in the way we're thinking about these two. Anita, I didn't mean to make as much of a conflict between the two different approaches. We need the corporations, we need Sarah's work, we need your work to be looking at all these incredible innovations within the corporations. And then we need to take the next level where there's systems of firms working with NGOs, working with governments, working with their industry association. It's very unlikely that any one firm is going to crack the nut on sustainable aviation fuel, green cement, green steel. There has to be more work at the system level to look at these collaborations, but it starts with individual corporations doing exactly what you're saying. So I think there's much more alignment than maybe my initial comment suggested. And then Lamar, where's the marginal research that should stop? I'm really tired of reviewing papers on Chinese CSR, which is really bribery. If you look at the Chinese accounting standard, it's voluntary contributions to social and political actors who are often affiliated. And so I don't think we're learning a lot about corporate social responsibility and win-wins and anything from studying Chinese firms' disclosure of their voluntary bribes. And then where is there too little work? It's on horizontal, on identity group conflict and the way firms are contributing to populism, resentment against the status quo, identity group conflict, violence. The paper that none of you will go to on 3:30 on Tuesday is showing that as we're pushing climate transition into Africa and we're investing in massive solar plants in Africa, we're contributing to a rise of violence in the communities in which we're putting the solar plants, coming to the trade-offs that Vanessa was talking about. And we need to be thinking more about how multinational firms are contributing to violence, especially among disenfranchised identity groups in emerging markets, but also in inner cities in the United States.
So very quickly, because I want to hear from you all. First of all, I am tired of reviewing papers that use KLD or MSCI data. Just like don't use it, or like don't even use any existing data. Honestly, right? Because like there's so many issues with it. Collect your own, or do your own, experiments, especially in under, served, privileged, whatever context, right? We want to see more of that. And the second point, if you want to learn more about climate change and where to start, I'm actually hosting a webinar as part of like SMS Competitive Strategy IG, having 3 junior scholars who will talk about their research and what data they used and how to think about that. So that will be September 6th. The call will come out. But please, let's take more questions.
So let's take 3 more and then we'll come back to the panel.
This is on. I just want to prove to you that I know how to use a microphone. That's all. So I think we had a great conversation. Should be saying this is really a great panel, and it's very interesting to hear what you have to say. And I have a little list of things to say, and it's good news. Most of the points were discussed, especially the one on trade-offs, which has been such a problem for those people who do RCTs and who have achieved so little, and even worse with the trade-offs when they're added in as well. So we should be aware of this overall discussion. Look, I didn't like your comment because I think it was not you actually speaking. I think it's a frustration of a 7:30 meeting we're going to right now, because this was designed as a progressive meeting, and I think we've maybe come too early in the morning for it, but we've arrived at a point where we can now say, well, what have we said about these issues? And Connie did a great panel in designing it, and I talked about social value and gave some thoughts about it. And there are people here who talked in panel 1 who've got amazing papers on how to think about these issues on it. I mean, a lot of people in this room have done things which are very relevant to what you're talking about. I came through a policy master's degree, et cetera, and I ran programs for ANC and et cetera, Wharton and other people, and continuing that throughout my career. But I'm not unique. There are people who do this all around in this group. So I think it was just too harsh on it. But I think now is the moment maybe to say, well, okay, we heard the passion. So what is the actual reality? And I'm beginning to hear that reality and what the whole thing is. So what I've learned about this area is kind of this part of Simon which is not discussed too often. And that really is that there is a design thinking which goes along with professional schools. So they're often on design issues. And so how do you design a program, which is what Veet is talking about, which is effective on it? And I'm not, grand challenges doesn't mean much to me, to be honest with you, because I don't, for the reasons you've already said on it. And I think there's some problems also with just having, for example, classes on social value. And the reasons why that's really a problem, because when you look at these programs, and forgive me for this, to say something so controversial on it, is that it's highly gendered. It's in terms of the overall ratio of women and men in the school, the ones who are in social, and it pays a lot less in the future. So if that's something we care about, we should make sure that this teaching, this knowledge, is throughout the whole school and involves thinking very closely with issues of finance and how to make profit, et cetera, and so on. I wanted to raise, when you think about an example, when you think about doing an executive program. So we've been asked, so funny, I hate to admit this to my Wharton colleagues, but I often go back to we Wharton, but I'm not sure they'll admit me back into the club anyhow. But still love me. But we did have the chance to have people come in from the outside and run programs. But we're expensive. In fact, we're all very expensive. In fact, we have to ask ourselves the question: are we putting our time, given how much society pays us, to the activities which really need us the most, given our training on it? And I think we probably very often make misallocations on it. So when you do a program, like for example, for Black entrepreneurs in Africa, financed by the AID of the US government, you say, well, why am I paying, my Wharton colleagues and myself this much money when I can do a collaboration with some other school which pays their faculty less? It may sound weird, and they can deliver a lot of things which we have priced ourselves out of. And we may have priced ourselves out on many things by now, but teaching basic accounting, et cetera, can be done by lots of people. Then you get to tell what you actually want to teach people in the room. And they also can teach you back, which is an incredible part of this area. And they come back to you and they say, well, competition, et cetera, and so on. Well, my experience is amongst social enterprises, they're often competing with each other. So all the things we're saying about strategy and strategies in the world of social value creation still exists. And many people don't achieve what they want. And part of the edge of that is that when BYD, build your own dream, says, I'm going to put a $1 billion plant into Turkey, that's private enterprise building the plant, just like Elon Musk did that. Private money for-profit intentions, building things which was not created by the social sector, and can't be done very well. So this all has to be discussed in the context of this room and the various parts which were approached. But now is the time to stop being passionate about this discussion and get real about it and talk about these trade-offs, which are so important, and the other things we raised. Have a serious discussion, including the quality of the research which is done by this community compared by a policy school. I'll give you the name of someone. Look at Scott Barrett's work over in Columbia on his, what we call stakeholder strategies, to what's been published in SMJ and elsewhere.
So I wanted to raise two, I think, challenges for the field. Very, very important panel, by the way. I really enjoyed all of the comments from the discussant, from the panelists. So two challenges, I think, that are actually quite poignant in this particular area when thinking about grand challenges. The first is, I think there's a mismatch between potential impact and incentives in the field. Because, as a number of you articulated, I think Mike most directly, we have things to contribute. They need to be part of a larger conversation. So if all we do is address these questions in the SMJ, then we're really missing a huge opportunity to have a broader impact. But at the same time, as we're all aware, the incentives is to publish in the field. And especially for junior scholars, I think we have to think more innovatively about how we make the potential impact match with the incentive systems that academics have. The second challenge that I'm also concerned about is the role of ideology. Bruce brought this up on the first day. Yesterday, we were having a discussion with Dan, where he is, about who's joining the field. And one of the big motivations for a lot of people to do a PhD, especially in strategy, including in strategy, is the desire to have impact on big issues that are affecting society more broadly, that involve firms, but that have a broader impact. And of course, that ideology, that passion is a wonderful thing, right? We've discussed about how lots of good research coming out of it, addressing important big issues that are outstanding there. But at the same time, the ideology can also affect the types of research questions people take on, what types of results are acceptable, celebrated. There's both an individual level, so dynamic here, but also a group dynamic or a collective dynamic. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or whether you could address maybe in your article, how do we deal with both of these challenges?
Laurence Capron from INSEAD, just a couple of observations. On the question about whether it should be grand challenges should be part of strategic management, I think we don't have the choice. I think if we want to remain relevant, it's a demand side argument, but if I reflect on my experience at INSEAD with executive education programs, in our flagship programs with board members and senior executives, they ask for that content. And they ask for sustainability content. They push back in the feedback form, we want more. They also want to know about, their own career risk. You know, they want to reflect, for example, on what happened at Danone with Emmanuel Faber, for instance. For board members, they want to understand how they can structure the design and incentive system of their CEO to include social outcome and not just efficient output. And the other observation is on the research side, and I think I would like to build on the Vanessa comment as well. I think yesterday we have a very interesting panel with Miles, Mary, and Rahul on the unit of analysis and whether ultimately we should do an explicit connection with value creation and value capture. And I think Vit, you also mentioned activity level system and coalition and ecosystem. So I think that we need to continue to try to build a consensus on that, on the DV, because as potential writers, but also as reviewers, we need guidance from the editors, how to assess a paper that look at these grand challenges, you know, and ultimately the link with the DV on value creation. Should we be firm-centric, or should we change the focus, and so that we don't put our field too much in a straitjacket?
Let's take one more and then we'll get responses here from the panel. I think somebody already has the mic.
Oh, sure. So I don't know if this is worthy of the last comment before we go back to comments, but just one thought around another opportunity for the field in this area that hasn't come up that I just wanted to interject into the conversation, which is the role of capital and ownership. So in a lot of this discussion, we've sort of assumed that firms are sort of the traditional idealized Burlean means corporations where they're sort of doing their stylized things, but thinking really seriously about the role of ownership, capital, and how those owners are directing firms and what their priorities are, I think is a very important piece of this puzzle that I think we've largely ceded to corporate finance. So there's really cool studies coming out of the finance departments on this. But they're really strategy studies, I think. And so taking very seriously comparative ownership to assume what the objective functions of different types of capital providers are and how those objectives can steer companies is something that I think should be well within the purview of our field. For me, that's, I've looked at purpose for the last 10 years. Purpose is really co-determined with who the owners are. And ownership is fundamentally shifting from where it was 20, 30 years ago. And so I wanted to interject that. And just one last piece of this, some of the most interesting discussions that I've had about purpose have been with law school professors. So both finance, but also law school. So the legal, side of the world is thinking very deeply around the corporate form and what corporations can do, and what purpose means and what personhood means. And so thinking about bringing in some of those ideas into our field and doing research on what does that mean for how companies act in this area, I think is an important part of the puzzle.
All right, let me turn to the panel and recognize we have 3.5 minutes. So you've got 1 minute, Olga, and then we'll get.
I need to first apologize because I was outside on a recruiting call for that one panel on the DV, so sorry, Connie. It was a socially constructed view. But I think what, I guess in 1 minute, what I can mention, what else we should be doing is just embracing these ideas, just being open to them, because I agree, Deepak, as he was saying, we see more and more PhD students that only want to work with like 1 or 2 faculty that are working on these issues. And if we all opened up, our horizons, I guess, to working on these grand challenges, we would learn ourselves. I learned a lot from my first PhD student, and we will expand the field and make it more relevant.
V?
So I'll try to link responses because of the minute. But I think it's really important that we're not training just corporate sustainability officers or thinking just about strategic management. This is a corporate problem. And so it's affecting the boards of directors, it's affecting the CEOs, it's affecting cross-functional coordination. The major we're offering is training people who are going into private equity, is training people who are going into consulting. It's not just training people who are going to be ESG specialists. I think that's really important. That does draw in the questions of ownership, corporate finance, law, others. What is the DV? I think it's really important to stay within strategic management on value creation, but think about how social value affects value creation. So kind of consistent with what Miles said. Ideology driving results. The largest ever cited paper that shows a win-win has been discredited by Andy King, and that's a real problem. So yes, we have to get beyond passion and just hoping that the results and the correlations are positive to better data and better results, and that's really critical.
Thank you. Vanessa.
I'll just say that I think, I'm really grateful to this conference because I think we have to have had all of these discussions and have a sense of where the agreements are and the disagreements are to get to kind of the important next part of sort of, okay, well, this is lovely. What do we do now? And my guess is that there will be furtherings of these conversations, but I'm hearing that I think there's a lot of sort of implications for teaching, best practices of teaching, as well as for sort of the research side, maybe, some set of kind of guidelines or guidance that we want to provide researchers that are interested in this area, as well as the important point of sort of guidelines for reviewers and editors as well. So, I'm excited to see what this all looks like in the future.
I just want to end, maybe be provocative and take on this point about ideology. So people are coming in to get their PhDs and they have passions and interests. I hope everybody who got into their PhD program had passions and interests. Our students are coming in with passion and interest. In addition to the work that I do on sustainability, I do work on technology, digital technology, AI. No one ever says that work is ideological. It's an ideological work you're doing there. So why is it that when I look at, electric vehicles, that's ideological, but when I look at, AI adoption, oh, that's an interesting, area of study there. And I agree with the notion that if your passion and interest, not ideology, drive the way in which you do your results or it leads to bad research, well, that's bad. We should all agree upon that. But this idea that the very choice to look at interesting questions makes you an ideologue, I just don't understand that premise. And I find that just infuriating that is kind of thrown out over and over again to those of us interested in these areas that, oh, you're obviously an ideologue or you have an ideological bent here. No, I am a interesting person who has interests and passions, and I've chosen to look at a set of questions here. In the same way, if you're really interested in total quality management, awesome, do that work. If you're interested in AI, great, HR, whatever it might be. But it's not ideology. It's just passion and interest.
I just want to add on that. The idea that libertarians are criticizing investors and firms for getting involved in ESG, and their answer is to regulate that out of existence, suggests the ideology is a little inconsistent. So let's call that out for what it is.
Thank you to this panel. We wanted to end this conference on a crescendo. We were not slotting this in the worst slot. And of course, as an editor, we are massively interested in this topic at our journals. I think I probably speak for other strategy journals as well, but we certainly speak about it in terms of strategy science. We're going to take a 15-minute break and be back. Okay.
Please take your seats. Our program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and come on in the room. Let's do for our last session.
Please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
All right, in anticipation of everyone needing to leave, get those that the 12:50 flights, we're going to make sure we get out of here on time. And so I will turn it over to Ronnie. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. A little more enthusiasm for the last panel, please. Good morning. Okay. Everybody knows that I talk fast. And so with so many people catching flights, I will talk faster than usual. But I do want to thank Jay and Todd just one more time because this is really special. I mean, this is really special. I can speak for, I think, most people in the room to say I've never seen all these people in one room together. So when someone speaks and they stand up to talk and I say, I've never seen that person at a conference with that person, only Jay and Todd could do it. It's the reason we're having the conversation. It's also a credit, I want to say, to the University of Utah and the Eccles School of Business for the convening power. So thank you guys for doing that. I also want to thank Rajshri Agarwal, Subi Rangan, my sort of collaborators on this. It's been really fun to work together. You know, we have not worked together on a paper before per se, but being able to work on this has been really fun. And I also think when we think about modes of collaboration, co-authorship is one thing, but actually doing some of these kind of platform events where you collaborate, but you don't necessarily write yet the way we're doing is a really great way to get to know people from different fields. A few people have asked me about the title as well. So some people said, when is the industrial policy panel, Ronnie, that you're going to be doing? And you notice that there's the word industrial policy is not in the title at all. And then some people have said, where's the panel where you tell us why strategy scholars have to be involved in public policy? But public policy is not in the title. This, though, is a product of Subi and Rajshri and I working together and trying to figure out what we're interested in. I will talk about the experience I had in public policy a little bit. I'll talk about how I think industrial strategy and policy is changing fundamentally what we do as scholars. But we're going to bring in a flavor from the type of work that Rajshri and Subi are interested in as well and talk about the bigger picture. And I think the thread that we have here is the rise of the activist state. And we're not using that in a pejorative sense. Rajshri and I in particular are going to have different views on the activist state. But I think it's a very good description of the new world we're living in. When my students come and they ask me, you know, what's the defining era or what's the defining term of our era, most of them are thinking about AI. I would submit that what we're going to talk about is what's going to define the careers of most of my MBA students, more so, let's say, than AI on its own, although it's part of it. So let me run into that. I'll talk for just 20 minutes or so. We'll hand it over to Rajshri and then Subi, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm going to set my stopwatch to make sure we get it right. So I'm going to talk about how the world's being rewired and what I think it means for us as strategy scholars. Let me get right to it. My big message, if you're going to take one thing away from my remarks, the background music is changing. Everything we've been doing in the last 30 years is set against the backdrop of context of globalization on the march. Capital markets opening up, labor markets being more free, countries becoming more integrated. And I believe that's changing. And I think if we don't change the research we do, not in sort of a normative sense to say this is good or bad, but a positive sense to say, here's what's happening, we're not going to be relevant in the next generation. And if you think about how many things are changing at the same time at the ecosystem level, going back to the panel that Miles, Rahul, and others did earlier, I think it's going to change each level of analysis and what we're looking at, from the individual to the firm to the country and to the broader technology stack as well. Some people call this deglobalization, the US and China moving further apart. Some people call it decoupling, two great powers building kind of alternative systems. And others are attributing it to the rise of populism, both on the right and left, that Veet talked about. I think one thing we can agree on is that activist states, not just here in the United States, but around the world, in India, in Korea, in China, in Japan, in Australia, in France, they're on the rise, and industrial policy is back. What do I mean by industrial policy? I'll be more specific with my work in a second. But for now, working definition for this session, it's government support of critical industries, primarily through tax incentives and subsidies. Industrial policy traditionally is actually a much broader framework, but we're going to talk primarily, at least I'll talk primarily about that. Now, when you think about what it means for firms and markets, that's what Subi and Rajshri and I are going to focus on. There's another piece, though, about individuals that I don't want to get lost here. Zeke Hernandez was a part of this panel. He had a teaching commitment at Wharton that was unavoidable, so he couldn't join us here. But we all learned, I think, a lot from Zeke in terms of thinking about the role, particularly on migration. And so we'll try to bring that into the discussion, but I would say you should read Zeke's fantastic book on immigration, and we consider him to be a full thought partner in what we're doing here today. What I want you to think about at the end of the presentation is, if you believe what we're saying, if you think that it is as important as we think it is, how's it going to change the questions you ask going forward? How's it going to change what you teach in the classroom? So I want to get started just a little bit with a Back to the Future example. Because a lot of our discussions have been strategy should move into this direction. Strategy should do something it hasn't done before. My argument is different. We were already doing this. If you read What is Strategy by Michael Porter, if you read all that stuff from the 1980s, you'll find all these really inconvenient and inexplicable paragraphs, which if you're born after a certain decade, you wouldn't understand, about Japan. And I remember reading this as like a grad student at Berkeley in the 2000s. I'm like, why is this guy so obsessed with Japan? Like, the Japanese economy by the time I was in grad school hadn't grown in like a decade, right? It wasn't as relevant to anything we were doing in strategy. And here, Michael Porter was obsessed with Japan. And if you looked around the Berkeley BPP program, we have many alums here today. There were lots of people who were remnants from that era. Why the heck was David Mowery, my advisor, studying something called Semitech? This sort of like, neo-socialist collaboration of firms trying to figure out how to share R&D on semiconductor equipment. What was going on here? Why was David Teese, right, talking about American competitiveness? What an old concept in a world where Robert Rubin was the most important policymaker, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair were talking about a third way. Globalization from the commanding heights was in the air when I was in school. So all this stuff seemed like an anachronism. We had a guy named Michael Gerlach, who was a student of Japanese business organization. He was an expert in Japan specifically. And the question is, why was all this at Berkeley at the time it was? And I think what we realized is that the folks who had studied strategy from the 1980s on grew up in a very different paradigm in terms of what they were working on. Mariko Sakibara is a good example. She's not here today. She was trained in METI, M-E-T-I, the Japanese Industrial Planning Organization. What got her interested in strategy was the planning work she'd done in Japan. So when she came to take an MBA at HBS, her motivation for studying strategy came directly from industrial policy. That all went out of fashion, of course, right? And so by the time I was doing my Berkeley BPP degree, we were studying different things. And I developed my academic identity. I think it's true for most of you during a time of peak globalization. And it shaped me in big ways. All my economics training, the only thing we ever said about industrial policy, well, two things. It's bad. Second thing, we don't pick winners. And we never double clicked on that because that was enough. Why? I mean, it's bad. It's been proven to be bad, and you never pick winners. So really, I hadn't thought about it for many, many years until I went back to the US government in 2021 and 2022. And for the first time in my life, I started to think about some of that stuff that, I hadn't actually read closely enough before, let's say 1996. I started to read, right, what Semitech was. I started to understand why David Mowery was so obsessed in how government was funding R&D. I started to think about the history of Silicon Valley and the connection between national security and innovation and entrepreneurship and firm strategy. And so for me, I think both the BPP imprint, the Berkeley BPP imprint, but also the government experience is kind of shaping what I'm going to talk to you about today. Does that make sense as a way to start? Okay. So if you ask Laura Tyson, who was not my advisor, but one of my mentors, more since grad school than during, there was a really important debate in the late 90s when she was chair of the CEA between her and Michael Boskin, who was the chair of the previous administration. And the question was, are computer chips and potato chips the same thing? The Econ 101 answer is, it doesn't matter, right? Whether your company, whether your country is producing potato chips and that's your comparative advantage, or computer chips, just do what your comparative advantage is and trade with your ally, trade with your partner, and you'll have better potato chips and they'll have better computer chips. But Econ 102, for all of us who've done that, says they're very different. They're very different. Because if you're a country that produces the most advanced semiconductors in the world, and you have a lock on the supply of those chips that are powering everything from the most advanced weapons to the electric grid to automobiles, then where you make stuff does matter. And my friend Chris Miller, his book Chip War, articulates this in really detailed fashion. But what I did in the US government was trying to figure out how to solve this problem, right? How we'd figure out the risks of geographic concentration balanced against the tremendous benefits created by global supply chains. We were moving from a world of just in time to a world of just in case. And that is a paradigm shift in terms of how we think about global value chains and chips. When I got to the government in 2021, I was the chief economist at the US Department of Commerce. My big job was what everyone's job was in the government then, what to do about inflation. The biggest driver of core CPI, the Consumer Price Index in 2021, was automobile prices. About 1/3 of our increase in inflation was from automobiles. What was driving automobile price increases? Chip availability. These weren't the most advanced chips, the kind made by TSMC or fabbed in Taiwan. These were the chips made by companies like Infineon or Global Foundries. These were chips that you wouldn't call advanced, you called them legacy, but when the airbag in your car saves your life, you don't complain that it's old technology. But that's what is saving your life, a 28 nanometer chip powering an airbag in the driver assist system. This had huge economic costs when we didn't get the chips on time, $240 billion in 2021 alone. So it was a #1 issue. And people ask me, who in the federal government works on supply chains? You all know I'm not the only one here who's worked in the US government. I'm not the only one who's advised governments. I'm not the only one who's worked in policy. When I looked around, though, there was nobody working on supply chains. And if you ask people who'd served in previous administrations, it's not clear who was supposed to be working on supply chains. Again, that seemed like some sort of prototypic managing supply chains, thinking about industrial competitiveness that had no relevance anymore, right? Why would you worry about supply chains when everything showed up on time? When I ordered something from Amazon until the pandemic, it showed up the next day and sometimes the same day. Why would we worry about where the chips were coming from? And so I went on this journey to try to understand how to define supply chain resilience. I immediately recognized I should have paid a lot more attention to my supply chains and operations colleagues at Duke and around the world. But as I started to learn about this, I started to say, this is a whole new paradigm for thinking about how firms behave. Every boardroom was having a conversation about a China +1 strategy at that time, trying to figure out how to diversify supply outside China for things like iPhones, machine tools, car parts. And these strategic decisions were not going to be easy because we had built so much dependence on China as a manufacturing workshop for the world. But now, unlike the time when I worked for President Obama, we were focused on American resilience. Build back better was the term President Biden used. Build back better in the United States of America. When we looked around, we realized we didn't have all the tools, we didn't have all the industries, we didn't have all the people we need to do that. So we started to think about how to deal with this global value chain with semiconductors. It's not very easy to be self-sufficient in semiconductors when they pass through multiple continents and have multiple firms involved. We have someone from the Netherlands here, right? ASML, really key firm in Eindhoven in the Netherlands that makes the lithography equipment that's essential to making the most advanced chips. In Taiwan, TSMC, the most important foundry in the world, not responsible for designing chips, but making the chips and the most advanced chips, the same ones that are powering the AI revolution that Rob Siemens' panel talked about. And of course, in the United States, we have companies like NVIDIA, right? Recent stock market darling that's designing the most advanced chips. But of course, NVIDIA logic chips don't work on their own to drive AI. You also need memory, high bandwidth memory to store all the data that you're going to trade. And that comes from companies in Korea, like Samsung and SK Hynix. How can you take a global value chain like this and be self-sufficient? And our military leaders identified chip self-sufficiency as a #1 issue for the United States. Again, this was new. I never thought much about national security and business at the intersection. I didn't thought that firms like Intel, Samsung, TSMC would need to think about where they were located from a national security standpoint as much as we did during the pandemic. And so the job with the CHIPS Act was to figure out how to increase US self-sufficiency in chips. An endeavor that many people in this room probably think is impossible and foolhardy. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical. I'll tell you why we thought it might work. There were 4 pillars of what America did during this period to bring back industrial policy. The American Rescue Plan, I won't talk much about. The infrastructure law, roads, rails, bridges, broadband. But the 2 key ones, and Veet mentioned this as well, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the largest clean energy subsidy bill in American history, and the CHIPS and Science Act. When we passed the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022, I moved over to the White House and I ran the $52 billion program to allocate the money and make sure that we ran the program in a way that was consistent with the president's values. So my approach to industrial policy really comes through the CHIPS and Science Act. There were a lot of synergies, though, between the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act that are affecting the way I think about things now. Think about the impact or the inputs to making chips and solar panels. There actually is an overlap, and Rahul and I talked about this earlier. There's polysilicon, which can either be semiconductor grade polysilicon or solar panel grade polysilicon. Some of the inputs to these industries are the same, and we have to think about that from an industrial policy point of view. Again, for a lot of you, this might sound like wow, a bunch of technocrats pulling a bunch of levers to think about supply. And yes, there's a lot of disadvantages to this and a lot of risks that Rajshri, I'm going to give Rajshri the floor to talk much more about them. I'm cognizant of them. And we're weighing these trade-offs in terms of thinking about US national security on one hand, right, versus the real drawbacks of industrial policy on the other hand. And one thing to watch throughout this discussion is, in economics specifically, and I think in our field as well, there has been very little interaction between the discipline and people who think about national security all day. And when those conversations are happening, they're happening more, there's a whole new language that needs to be built up to talk about these issues. Because right now what happens if you're in the room doing your fancy economic analysis and someone with a bunch of ribbons on their chest and a military uniform comes in and says, well, I don't care about any of that analysis. We have to do it. Otherwise, our nation's at risk. No toolbox that you have is good enough to win that argument, right? No toolbox, but that's a problem, right? Because what can national security be used to justify? Should we be putting tariffs on electric vehicles at a time we're trying to fight climate change and deal with the grand challenges that Mike Lennox's panel were talking about, right? You may agree with me on chips, but vehemently disagree with me on EVs. And so when we let national security be the catch-all explanation for doing everything, we're entering an interesting world. And for firms, when they are drafted into the cause of national security, when you're an American firm or a Korean firm, not a global firm, that also changes the incentives for managers. Sometimes you might argue in positive ways, and sometimes in negative ways. One important thing to think about is the impact on the country. I thought a lot about the EV transition during my time, and there's a real contrast, I think, between EVs and chips. I'll make a few points here. One is we want to produce as many electric vehicles as possible if you care about climate change. If your primary goal is a grand challenge to deal with global climate change, we need cheap electric vehicles that people buy, regardless of where they're made from. And here we are fighting amongst each other of where those electric vehicles are made. But if you think about that, that's running exactly counter to thinking about the grand challenges that Mike's panel was about. It's like Game of Thrones, and sorry to ruin it for people, we're all fighting right amongst ourselves, but the real threat is beyond the wall. The White Walkers are climate change in this example, okay? Sorry to ruin it for you. We didn't have a lot of this technology in the United States. And so we needed to make batteries in the US, but we couldn't make them without Chinese companies like CATL. But the problem with these battery joint ventures is they weren't necessarily covering labor union contracts that guaranteed particular wages and hours. So this created a lot of challenges with labor stakeholders. It goes to the stakeholder panel again that Anita McGann led. If we're going to take stakeholders seriously, if we're going to take climate change seriously, if we care about national security, how are firms like Ford, which does not have the technology right now to build the batteries we need for the EVs we want to buy, going to navigate that solution? That's a C-level issue. It's a strategy issue. It's at the firm level. But like Miles's panel, it's at the ecosystem level, managing labor, managing government. This, to me, is the new normal for what our firms are going to have to deal with. Something that they wouldn't have had to think about 10 years ago because a partnership with a Chinese company, raising money from a Saudi sovereign wealth fund, right? Having a Russian oligarch on your cap table. These are things that weren't as big issues as they are today. And it's going to change, I think, a lot of the assumptions we have about how we study firms. The other thing that doesn't get mentioned enough, even our conversation about stakeholders, is workers and unions. There's been a huge upswing in union activity in the United States. And you've seen unionization in parts of the country, the South where I come from, and in industries like retail that you haven't seen before. This is going to change the bargaining power between workers and firms in ways that we haven't thought about in business schools for a long time. How many of you mentioned the word union in your strategy class? How many of you teach that as something that managers need to think about? And again, this is not a normative argument to tell you you should care. I'm telling you, if you want to prepare your students, it'd be malpractice not to get them to understand this because they're going to have to care in these industries, okay? China's playing a leading role in the supply chain. We know a lot about that, but there's other nations too. When's the last time you had a conversation in your class about Chile and their role in lithium? When's the last time you talked about Indonesia and cobalt, DRC, Lamar mentioned, and copper? Russia, Ukraine, neon gas is one of the most important inputs to the semiconductor industry. 90% of it comes from Russia and Ukraine. These are all going to be hotspots in the world that are going to shape the way we think about global value chains, especially when we can't get the materials that we need. And so the other thing I want to talk about just real quick is our backyards. So here in North Carolina, right, not here, sorry, in my home in North Carolina, we're thinking a ton about these investments and where they're coming. We're seeing $1 billion investments in building silicon carbide chips, the kind of chips that will power electric vehicles. We're seeing billions of dollars investments to build electric vehicles, the first foreign electric vehicle plant built in the United States. We're seeing billions of dollars into batteries. So North Carolina as a state is putting together an economic strategy to attract battery investment. And you're going to see that have a big impact on which firms locate in places like ours. I see that industrial policy is on the rise. The World Bank, the IMF, and others are paying attention. They've gotten to this before we have, to be honest. And they're seeing a rise when you analyze policies across the world in industrial policy. The line that's moving up more sharply is advanced economies, rich ones. The line that's moving at a more sort of gradual pace is emerging markets. So if you think this is just an emerging market thing, it's actually growing faster in the most advanced countries. But this goes back to what Mike talked about with grand challenges. The people who are making industrial policy decisions do not know what you all know about firms. And that's a huge problem. Think about how you would design industrial policy if you know nothing about how firms actually worked. And so there is this translation exercise and really a call to action if you care about this stuff for us to get involved in these debates, right? Again, put the normative side, put the normative stuff aside for a second. This is happening. So if you want better or worse industrial policy, strategy people should probably be at the table. And I have lots of ideas. I'll talk about the Q&A, how to do that. I will say, not everyone has to get into this. Not everyone has to go spend 2 years in the government. In some sense, when I did that work, I was bringing the collective knowledge of this room and everything I've learned from people in this room into that. When someone like Ethan Malik is making a huge impact on AI and its adoption in companies, he's bringing the stuff he's learned from the rooms like this. So the field is healthy, not just when all of us are writing papers about grand challenges and public policy, but when we're getting some of our people to become ambassadors and put in the work and do it. Not all of us have to do it for us to be a field that has influence. And I think that's something important to think about throughout the entire panel. Non-market strategy is going to change as well. I always said non-market strategy is a non-good name. It's not like a great title for a field to get people really excited. But when I think about non-market strategy, I think about firms intersecting with government, firms impacting society that then translates its preferences into who they choose. But what if now it's going to look like this? You can't play both sides of the coin anymore. When my students show me one of these awesome hockey stick charts with a total addressable market, $1 gajillion, I always say, well, you're going to sell your drones to the US and China? Not going to happen anymore. Not going to happen. I can tell you it's not going to happen. So we're going to have to divide your TAM by half. That does a heck of a lot for the valuation. It's going to change the assumptions in the model. And by the way, when you're deciding, can we build a data center in the UAE so we can have the most advanced chips training new models in Arabic language, right, using all that data, powered by 2 cents a kilowatt hour nuclear energy? The US government's going to have an opinion on that. And that's what Sam Altman and OpenAI have figured out. So these strategic decisions are going to be shaped by these things on the non-market side as well. I think this will be especially true in deep tech. Deep tech, Fiona Murray and other people have defined it, technology that takes massive amounts of capital because you need scientific and technological breakthroughs for them to come to fruition. Some parts of generative AI, quantum computing, space tech, had tip to Rahul Kapoor for that one, synthetic biology, and some parts of energy like green hydrogen, which Veet mentioned earlier. These are things that require a lot of R&D, a lot of capital, but they're also all national security adjacent. And so what I'm seeing in all of these deep technology areas is a massive role of government. What's different now, if the previous wave of technology, the internet, rise of e-commerce made the world flat, deep tech is going to make the world jagged because nation states are asserting themselves in the funding and regulation. This is the activist state. This is what Rajshri and I are going to go back and forth about. And we're actually going to agree on a lot of the reasons I think why, but some of the how, right, is going to create really interesting issues for strategy scholars. Quantum computing is a great example. These are all the firms that are involved in some part of the quantum computing value chain. But this is a picture of firms. And again, this is not telling you the whole story because the quantum computing race is not a race between firms. You'd be missing it. If our unit of analysis was a firm, you'd be missing what quantum computing is really about. Because quantum computing has the potential to break the most complicated encryption, protecting all of our secrets, not just like your email password, but like all of our military secrets. And so the race in quantum computing is not between firms, it's between countries. Because most deep technologies have dual use. And so the French are making massive investments to try to leapfrog in quantum because they have fantastic capabilities in quantum. Okay, Australia just made a $1 billion Australia sole source investment in PsiQuantum, a company that's going to locate the first quantum computer in Brisbane, Australia. The Chinese are spending 4 times as much money as the Americans now on quantum computing. It's a race where government and firms are working together. And it's very difficult to play both sides. A French company called Pascal had an investor who wanted to put $100 million on the table to advance a quantum computer. The problem was that investor was Saudi Aramco. And if the only investment source that you have to scale up your amazing quantum computer is Saudi Aramco and you're a French firm, you have stakeholder challenges, you have government challenges, not to mention the traditional commercial and technical challenges that we all teach in our classes. I'm integrating this into my teaching. I'll be brief on this. Take all the 5 forces. Ask new questions. Barriers to entry, industrial policy changes them. Competition, reliance, not Shell in India, right? There's a reason for that. If you look at what India is doing, what the Modi government is doing, it's Adani and Adani. Reliance and Adani Group, who are receiving a lot of funds to build out ports to power, green hydrogen, everything in between. Samsung in Korea. Customers, divide the world up into 2, maybe more. Barriers to entry, the EVs in Europe, and of course, substitutes. Once we do carbon border adjustment taxes, right? Carbon intensive products like steel are going to be at a disadvantage compared to greener alternatives. It's also changing strategic decisions at the firm level, which I'm not going to delve into now, but I think hopefully I've made this point already, just in the interest of time. Some research questions to ask. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think I'll divide them into a few groups: people and places. This won't fit in many cases the unit of analysis discussion at the firm level in every case, but it's a really important decision that firms have about where to locate. Innovation, I don't think we've talked enough about innovation actually at this summit as a general matter, but I would say when you think about how firms use tax credits and subsidies and the effect on their innovative behavior, it's really, really going to be a key set of questions. One big thing to look at for people who study inventors, how does this affect collaboration between US and Chinese scientists, for example, which is necessary in many of these areas? That's going to be something to watch. Organizational structure, Sequoia, the famous venture capital firm, just broke up into 5 different separate firms. Why does Sequoia, this storied venture capital firm, which assets under management higher, you're a better firm, why would they break up into 5? It's the same reason my students have to divide their TAM by 2. It's no longer tenable to raise money from limited partners like the North Carolina Pension Fund and invest them in Chinese startups that are working with the People's Liberation Army. You can't do that anymore. 5 years ago, yes. Today, you can't do it. Similarly, you can't raise money from Chinese LPs and invest them in national security sensitive US companies. That's why Sequoia is into 5 different parts. Non-market strategy questions, many. One is, and Rajshri will get to this more, how do you avoid regulatory capture? How do you avoid distorting the rules of the game? And we know in many of these examples, the firms have done this with regards to industrial policy. Hat tip to Claudine for bringing up this idea about financing. We don't think about capital flows, I don't think enough in our groups either. That's changing as well. Miles' panel talked a lot about the ecosystem. And when I think about the ecosystem that includes OpenAI, designing algorithms for AI, NVIDIA, making the chips that will help you train those models, Samsung, making the memory chips necessary to make that possible, the data centers that you need to have, in some cases, proximate to where the inference is happening, and some places it can be farther away, and the energy sources downstream that are related to a lot of the work Mike Lennox is doing. That stack between OpenAI all the way to Florida Light and Power, that's an ecosystem that we need to think about going forward that's going to be affected by all these things. And I will say one thing, AI could either be a climate solution, Vanessa Bourbano's NSF panel is about that, or it could be the worst thing we've ever seen for climate change. Microsoft, Google increased their carbon emissions last year, right? They're not on track for net zero because in part of the boom in AI. This is a great way, by the way, to study purpose versus profits. What will be the impact of AI on carbon emissions? A couple caveats. I'll let Rajshri talk about all the downsides of activist governments. In this one, it'll appear more oppositional than it is. We'll debate a little bit, but we agree on a lot of the stuff. She'll have some good points. I'll let her make those. Deepak Samaya made this great point about this maps to ideology in uncomfortable ways. The problem with all this stuff is if you get really excited about this industrial policy stuff, you're also occupying a part of the political spectrum and have a position on the role of government. And if we let this pollute our research in ways that make us blinded to answering the hard questions, it's going to be challenging. So we'll talk about that. I will say, surprisingly though, in the United States, kind of both Republicans and Democrats agree with a lot of this stuff, which is a real interesting. The CHIPS Act was a bipartisan bill because it's about national security. Interesting thing to watch going forward. How broadly will we define national security is the thing I want you to leave you with. Let me just show you my paradigm and then I'll wrap up. I'm thinking about a new world that has 4 pieces. Many firms are trying to accelerate deep technology. Gen AI, quantum computing, climate tech. The capital to fund those technologies is going to necessarily come from government and private capital for reasons we talked about. But it's going to have to be trusted capital because of how sensitive these technologies are, which is going to change the way the capital providers are raising money and allocating money. And that includes PE firms like KKR. It includes the National Science Foundation. This is going to require a new understanding of geopolitics, something that V and other people know a lot about. We're building new alliances around the world. The Quad is this alliance between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Why that group? Well, that is going to be a hedge in the Indo-Pacific to China. And it's ostensibly a defense organization, but there's a capital investment component as well, with firms from those four aligned countries investing along the way. The way to bring geopolitics closer together is often through companies, which is another thing we can explore. It's only going to work if we expand local economic opportunity. The rise of populism that we talked about on both the left and the right is in part due to the lack of opportunities that spin out of these systems. The previous neoliberal paradigm didn't create enough opportunities in many cases for people to feel like they were vested in the system. It's not clear yet whether this new flywheel will do that as well. So with that, let me stop. I want to kick it over to Rajshri, and then she'll speak, and then we'll have Subi, and then we'll take some questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you again. I'm actually going to stand here. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Thanks for being here to the very, very end. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this excellent, excellent summit. And thank you in particular to Teresa Fish one more time. If things go so seamlessly, you know that there is a hand there. This is a session that comes after a lot of things that we're going to be able to connect together, hopefully. And hopefully this is going to lead us with more disagreement, which is a good thing, I think. Divergence before you can get convergence is a very good point. And in fact, I must say that as I'm going to be talking about the consequences of activist states for enterprising firms and markets, I am very conscious of the fact that I'm in a minority, and that doesn't have anything to do with me being a woman or brown, but more in terms of ideas. And so let me channel Bruce. Let's be transparent about the values that we bring into our research. And so what are the core values that at least ignite my passions? And that comes from my origin story too. Strategy is, of course, about making choices. And I was born in a culture where my father told me that the person I marry, and of course I couldn't work for a living, was his choice to make, not mine. And I lived during a state which was very paternalistic, had 5-year plans. This was pre-liberalization. And in a culture where whom you married and what you worked on was defined by birth in this caste system, which still remains today. It's not gone altogether. And this is not just an issue for India. This was also a similar pyramid could be built for the serfs versus the lords in the Western world. And this gets us back to a very nice book that North Wallace and Weingast made, which relates to violence and social orders. And the main premise of this book is all societies must deal with the presence of violence. How do societies limit violence? They do it by creating limited access, privileged interests. You cannot be a lord because you weren't born in that sense. Modern societies create open access to political and economic organizations by fostering political and economic organizations. And their point was, this is going to be a very fragile one, because at any point in time, anyone who is at the top of the pyramid has very good reasons to stay there and is going to keep trying to make it a limited access society. And so what is the key feature, according to them, about open access societies? Impersonality. That's the central feature. Everyone is treated the same. Now, is that true? No. Is it true today? No. But if you think about the societies that were existent in the 1900s, before the 1900s, the 1500s, we've come a long way, particularly in some societies as opposed to others. Why? And today, especially, the world that we live in as strategy scholars, when we can talk about strategy as choices that decision makers make, whether it's individuals or firms or at the ecosystem or collaboration level, we take for granted the fact that we each have a freedom to choose to some extent or the other. And so markets and organizations actually are first and foremost platforms for collaboration among enterprising individuals. And competition is important because it creates discipline and a focus on the value add. You cannot be at the top of the economic pyramid if there is no barriers to if there are no barriers to mobility. And here the role of the state is critical because it not only protects you from external and internal sources of violence, but it creates the legal systems for the protection of individual rights. And why am I making this point? Because at least the way I view, the way I teach in my class, I talk about each individual as a future strategy empowered decision maker. And I say an enterprising trader Sudoku, whether you're working within an organization in teams or whether you're transacting in markets, really requires you not to just focus on the transactions. What am I doing? What are you doing? But really this 9-part in a trader Sudoku, where me and you are choices. We have chosen to be here today. We could have done a lot of other things. Why did we choose to be here today? Why are each and every one of us engaged in a multi-person trader Sudoku right now? Because what we're going to do and what I'm going to do and what you're going to be doing is dictated by my aspirations and your aspirations. Psychology and philosophy plays a role out here, as well as our shared purpose. What problems are we wanting to solve collectively, and why are they aligned also with our complementary capabilities? So a lot of our strategy has actually focused with the economics lens, and I'm guilty of that too, on the capabilities and the transactions aspect. But a lot of the conversations we've had in this summit is the need to recognize the psychological motivations and the philosophical values that make us humans, make us who we are. So what are the consequences in terms of enterprise and markets, particularly in open access society? This really relates to a point that Connie had made in the very first session, which is second session, which is where we need to think about growth, causes and consequences of growth. And of course, across the decades, across centuries, what we've seen is upward mobility in economic, intellectual, and psychological realms, right? So in the 1500s, before the 1500s, everybody was equally poor. And what you ended up seeing is the extent to which societies adopted openness. That was the extent to which the GDP rose too. You see this, Sergey Brzezinski and David Hounshell did a great job of not only looking across countries, but honing in within Japan. Why is it that it was the only country in the East that ascended to being industrialized? And they trace it to the cotton spinning industry. And when the government abandoned industrial policy is when the industry really took off because of the entrepreneurial experimentation that was enabled by it. More to today's future, Audra Wormall's, her dissertation, what did that teach me? That financial inclusion, a huge grand challenge, not solved by countries, not solved by activist states, solved by for-profit platforms. Of course, they had to work within the regulations, it's important, but these were the ones that really unleashed and created financial inclusion for the unbanked. This is not just about economics, it's also about the psychological well-being consequences. So here is a great story about how, of course, it's related to your GDP, but why is it that Finns are happier than the French? It's because they have more economic freedom. And of course, notice that a lot of the grand challenges that the last session was talking about, poverty, issues of inequality, they are much worse in closed access societies and in countries where the state plays a very, very important role. Think about Bangladesh and what's happening there just right now as an example of when an activist state takes complete control, even in economics. Why am I making this point? And of course, the final one, and this is a big shout out to Raj's work too, intellectual mobility. So in the US, when you had a brief period where there were H-1B visas that were given, you saw a lot of knowledge diffusion occurring from India and China into here, and a lot of patenting as a result of that diffusion of innovation for good things, for health, for example. So in this context, why do I believe, and Grant, you can go ahead and say, let's do some abductive research and infer the best explanation out here. right? I think that one of the core fundamental causes is what we've engaged in the nirvana fallacy. There are a lot of problems in the world that we have today. By the way, we've never had it as better as humanity. But yet we see a lot of the problems. And of course, those are the ones that propel us. So what is this nirvana fallacy? It is judging the practical today with the ideal that we want. Jason Brennan, who is at Georgetown, a great ethical philosopher, he talks about the fact that that's not fair because you're comparing practical capitalism to a utopian view of socialism. What you ought to be doing is really comparing practical capitalism to practical communism and socialism, and you should be comparing practical ideal capitalism to ideal socialism. And in both cases, capitalism has it beat. But more importantly, and related to the work that we do, judging the systems based on the imperfections that it inherited rather than it solves ignores the evolutionary processes through which open societies evolve over time. Shout out here to Rosenberg. Why did the West grow rich? Right? A lot of it is about the experimental capitalism. Connie said this. We need to do a lot more research on it. Dan said it. Given the hand that you're dealt, how do you perform? These are the issues that we really should be thinking about, as opposed to thinking about, well, how do I go ahead and create a solution that may actually undermine the longer term pillars that we're looking at? Why? Because governments differ fundamentally from enterprise and markets. Their fundamental role in society, I'm not an anarchist, I believe that governments need to exist, is because they need to guarantee political equality through institutions where individual rights are protected. But they're not producers of economic goods and services. And if not checked, politicians and regulatory agencies can wield enormous power on who are the producers, what and how they produce, and to whom these goods and services should be distributed. What is at stake here is the pillars on which we rely on as enterprising individuals within enterprising firms and markets and organizations. Those are the ones that are at risk at being attacked in the name of open access societies. So how does this relate to strategy and the research that we do? So channeling the first session, if I think at least about what are the domains in which we are interested in, and the first session as well as the second session did this very well, it's the why and the what, the content, right? Here, the content, the question that I would pose for you is, what are the consequences of blurred lines on this nice edge that North et al. Talked about in terms of the fragility of open access societies, the how, strategies used by activist states versus enterprising firms and markets, and of course the so what. What are the unintended consequences when you have this kind of intervention and regulation? So I'm taking a slide from Ronnie's thing, right? And notice, of course, that there are a lot of good intentions here. And I don't doubt these good intentions at all, of course. The problem is, road to hell paved with good intentions. So even when you're thinking about the why and the what, promote social goods, preserve local jobs, national security, of course, being the huge, big call, anything and everything, it's a national security issue, right? So how do we then, and Ronnie made a very good point out here, when the striped general comes in and says, this is about national security, all economics goes out the window. Critical to open access societies, right? So how can strategy scholars weigh in? And again, the need to back these insights with more research. So same, but salience and value of and balance of values differ, and firms respond by occupying different positions. Mike Lennox, right? For-profit firms identify their values and their mission, and what you have are stakeholders that go along with it. Not all of us have the same values. We can see that even in this room, right? Many of us come at it at a very different ones, right? But then more importantly, and this is channeling Claudine and Cindy and even the last panel that we just had, what happens when the why in the industrial policy conflict? Increased economic growth, but you want reduced inflation too. One might argue that the inflation was really Milton Friedman, a lot of money being posted in post 2020, you are going to have inflation. This is supply and demand of money, right? So it could be a government cost problem, again, solved by the government, more solutions by the government, creating more problems. That's the way I look at it very cynically. Climate crisis versus low energy and health and infrastructure costs. You can't have both. Increased science tech hubs versus reduced immigration, especially because immigration has been the key way in which we've been bringing a lot of the high tech, but not just high tech, all skill levels out here. So how are we dealing with these trade-offs? This is also an issue that Bruce brought up in the last session. Channeling a seam in Gotham. What if good intentions mask underlying opportunistic goals, right? So studying the why, even at the individual level. Why are we so quick to say, oh, CEOs, entrepreneurs, greedy? But we forget that politicians want to be reelected, right? So how does the quest for power and personal gain in public actors that want to meet these public good meals relate to for-profit businesses in solving the same problem? Right? And we've got headlines to show about that, right? Worries about FTC overstepping, right? The inconvenient truth about ESG investing. More importantly, the fact that political self-dealing goes on in the United States as we speak. So that is about the why, and we need a lot more studies out there. But the how matters too, right? So you're looking at 1.9 trillion, 550 billion, 500 million. I mean, these are big numbers. Taxpayer dollars that bureaucrats have access to. And of course, they're deciding what to do with them. But how are they deciding that? You know, one of the things, I'm part of the FESAC, which is the Federal Economic Statistics Advisory Committee. And we had a presentation more recently as it relates to the CHIPS Act. And one thing that I was just completely boggled over is that these policies have often been constructed and given money to when the fundamental questions have not been asked or answered, right? So the questions that the FESAC committee was asked about in this Bureau of Census help us understand what industries are critical for national security supply chain. What are the current employment figures? What is the current import-export? We don't have this. These policies are being constructed without full information and knowledge of the very important hows. Again, because strategists are not in the room. Thank you for being there, Ronnie, helping at least expect these problems. But I think that there's still this sense that these are how questions that we don't know. So how can strategy scholars answer this question? If I were to channel Rita, it's not just government funds, but how these funds are deployed and by whom, whether it's contracts, grants, or cooperative agreements. And this is, of course, consistent with the research that I did with Maka and Sojin regarding selection processes and use of command and control versus coordination in mission-oriented grant challenges, much of which towards national security. Sergio is out here, Anita and Peter belong in here too. Governance structures of hybrid organizations is key. So it's not just that hybrid organizations are good, but how are they doing these strategies? What are the strategies? Alfonso channeling Rosenberg, Violina and Michael, right? In a world of uncertainty, experimentation requires bets. There is no omniscient social planner that is going to be able to do that. And there are huge consequences to this for that. JP's got a paper with Sojin where the government with COVID tests went directly with one test and in fact refused and discouraged the instant tests from being created in the United States. And so JP is looking at this question of, did firms go against these regulators? Who did so and why did they do so? These are strategy questions. Britta Glennon has an awesome set of studies. And one of the big questions is how much of our current problems in the US, which is about offshoring, is caused because of US immigration policies in the first place? Channeling Zeke and Raj again, what's the role of the current immigration policy in the potential labor shortage? If the CHIPS Act is going to create all of these jobs, who's going to be there to fund it? You know, Mike Wright had this great paper which talks about the new statism, and I would really, it's in Academy of Management Perspectives, but here it gives you an example of what strategy and management scholars could be doing to address and understand new statism and what kind of lenses they should be using. And of course, the big question of so what? What are the intended and unintended consequences? Rita and Shruti talking about antitrust, they show that antitrust regulation against platform owners to create more competition, it actually decreased the profits of the complementers that they were trying to hurt, and it didn't matter to the platform owners at all, right? It didn't increase competitive entry either. channeling Melissa, right? Yesterday there was a Wall Street Journal article that talks about how AI startups are actually struggling because one important exit strategy for them, acquisition, is now curtailed because of the increased scrutiny on big tech. So even in non-national security issues, this kind of a regulation and a blanket, oh, it's for competition, it's actually unintended consequences are exactly the opposite. And then Bruce's point about Porter's inversion of welfare economics, something that was echoed in the last panel right now, right? Non-market strategy, if you were to take a very narrow view of how is it helping the existing top of the pyramid firms, of course, lobbying is the best way to create limited access, right? But what does this mean then in terms of undercutting the very pillars that guide enterprising firms and markets? So questions to ponder on the so what. What are the long-term unintended consequences that create limited access? Rigid bureaucracies, waste of taxpayer monies, interest group warfare. We're seeing that already in terms of the instability and breakdown of institutions. Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So hopefully what we can do is think more seriously, not just about today's industrial policy versus 20 years ago versus 40 years ago versus 20 years later, but these fundamentally long-term issues of why is it that politicians and public agents are more well-intended than business leaders and entrepreneurs. The ones that I meet, they care deeply about the problems that they view in their world and how to solve it. The how, the strategy process, how does command and control mesh with entrepreneurial experimentation? Resource and selection processes are very different. And then the so what and performance. What are the long-term consequences of this in terms of rise of closed access societies, even in societies such as ours, which used to be relatively open? So call for research for strategic management scholars. They are under attack, even by people that are saying that they're defending it. And more research that's needed that does not engage in this nirvana fallacy, examines not only extreme cases or particular cases, but also representative of samples and long-term consequences, and carefully examines trade-off across intentions, mechanisms, and contradictions in underlying assumptions. Thank you.
Good morning. Jay, I was thinking about, the programs I run. One of the programs I run is for CEOs at INSEAD. And I give them a little cube. And the cube says, it's your ship. Eventually, somebody will ask me, what does that mean? It's your ship. And I tell them, of course, you're in a business school. It's about your leadership. People say, yeah. And then I say, it's about your entrepreneurship. I say, yeah. And for some family business owners, they say, it's about your ownership. So I say, okay, we get it. But I ask them, which is the most important ship? Which is the most important ship? Relationship. And the most important relationship is friendship. Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much for having all of us here. I know that we meet so many friends. And to Rajshree's point about well-being, if there is some research to be believed empirically, it seems to suggest that relationships are so key to well-being. So I'm quite sure we'll leave these 2.5 days with a greater sense of well-being. Thank you very much. Now, I'm also going to draw on relationships. To me, everything I've learned is through people. And I've had the privilege to work with a very eclectic group of companies, people, institutions, governments, and public and private leaders. Among them, amazing philosophers, moral philosophers like Amartya Sen, but also people like Philip Kitcher, Anthony Appiah, Elizabeth Anderson, etc. And also great social scientists, people like Jim March, Ken Arrow, Jean Tirole, and many, many others. I'm drawing what I'm going to share with you is the work that I do with them and have done over the last decade. It's still very, very fluid, but I think it addresses some of the things we've been talking about this morning in the first panel, and then also now. And one of the things I realize is we're dealing, in a sense, with this incredible problem called the problem of interdependence. Ever since we created society 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and those those societies became nations. And we have a problem of interdependence both within societies and across societies. How do we resolve this problem of interdependence? The law and contracts are insufficient. It's obvious. This is why relationships are so important. And if we cannot begin to understand, and the economy influences relationships, whether it is between capital and labor, or across communities, or different preferences. So this is really one of the great challenges. And how do we go about this? How do we think about this? This is what I'd like to talk about. There's probably a lot of things that I will say that may be hard for many people here to understand. So I also want to try and keep it simple, if you will, in terms of my main telegram. Karl Polanyi, who's the image here, like many others before him, he said, what do human beings want? And he said, most human beings in the world, whether they're in the south or the north or the east or the west, we want two things. We want liberty and we want security. And he said, if you had to make a trade-off between these two, then most people would choose security over liberty. This is a terrible, terrible choice. And the title that I gave is this paradox of abundance. How can it be that in the 21st century, when after Francis Fukuyama, the fall of the Berlin Wall, end of history, we're still assembling here to kind of think about these things? And Jay, one other thought went in my mind. The first summit maybe was about the field strategy, strategic management. Maybe the second summit some 30 years ago was about bringing rigor to the field. And sure enough, that remains a huge challenge. But maybe this summit, Jay, is about bringing relevance to the field. And we need, of course, the field to be both rigorous and to be relevant. But I do think many of the discussions the first couple of days were really about the relevance of the field, along with the rigor, including in these sets of issues. So I think it's very timely. Thank you so much for bringing us here, Todd and Jay, together to talk about this. So my telegram, very simple. If firms want liberty, and firms love autonomy, they love liberty, to do the transfer pricing, to do the supply chain, to do the innovation, to do the kind of capital labor trade-offs that they want to make. If firms want liberty, they better understand that in the trade-off between security and liberty, the people, society, will go for security. And if firms want that liberty, then they better learn to contribute to that security. In a sense, I'm saying if we don't want public policy, we better start having private policy. Not only of the lobbying, non-market, traditional David Barron style. Abundance, the paradox of abundance, $105 trillion. The world average mean GDP, $13,000. We're rich. We are rich. So the median would be lower, the distribution is different. But if you look at this snapshot, whatever we've been doing over the last 100 years in a decentralized economic system has delivered if the wealth of nations and societies is what Adam Smith wrote about, addressing the economic interdependence through a division of labor and the expansion of markets and prices and information and incentive theories. Wow, it's really impressive. And it continues. Dow 40,000, crazy. I mean, just crazy. Corporate profits as a share of GDP are at record highs. Those corporate profits as share of GDP are reflected in the stock market. Stock markets are the record high in India, in Germany, in France, in Brazil, in the United States. It's just a global phenomenon. The capitalism, the Western decentralized economic system, has delivered incredible wealth. And the predictions are, with AI and everything else that's coming, the market is forward looking and says, hey, yeah, we make some adjustments here and there for different things, but the trend is just extraordinary. Now, there is a paradox, because at the same time as we have this abundance, we also have huge anger and anxiety. Anger when it comes to people, on the fairness of the economic system, on relative poverty, on a company like Boeing releasing a plane, or let alone the opioid crisis. It just seems unbelievable. And anxiety about climate and the ecology. So profits and market values are up. Performance has never been better, and AI promises to make it even better. But progress, not so great. Further beyond business per se is what Ronnie just talked about, the tech wars, the global conflict, a kind of liberal, illiberal spheres. This is not looking good. Defense spending has gone up almost everywhere, from France to Japan to India to China to Brazil. 2 trillion. That's the first time global defense spending has reached 2 trillion. We are preparing for something, and it's not a global peace. Doomsday clock, Oppenheimer, Einstein, 1947, they created this club of atomic scientists. And since then, every year the atomic scientists set a doomsday clock, 90 seconds to midnight. Whether it's for a nuclear war, whether it is for a climate collapse, or other pandemics, etc. So things aren't looking good. As Charles Dickens wrote, is the best of times and the worst of times, the paradox. What is a scorecard for business? Business has outperformed, but also underperformed. When it comes to output, GDP, amazing. Never been better. But when it comes to outcomes, whether it's on fairness, whether it's on health, mental and physical, whether it's on sustainability, not so great. Efficiency, unbelievable. Equity, regrettable. Whether it's the Gini coefficient or any other measure that you want to look at, it's just extraordinary. I mean, when Boeing spent over the last decade $45 billion on share buybacks and $15 billion on R&D. And journalists and investigators have asked if only that were reversed, if Boeing had spent 45 on the R&D and 15 on the share buybacks, would the 737 MAX have been the story that continues to dog this firm? Firms have achieved size, but not sustainability. So it's a mixed record. There's good news, and then there's needs improvement. And that, presumably, whether we are firm-centric or whether we are ecosystem-centric or industry-centric, there is definitely not only a question of the relevance of strategy and strategic management. The management part is super important. We've talked a lot about strategy. And as some of you have asked about the role of the individual, this is the core starting point. If it's turtles all the way down, institutions do not come out of thin air. They come from individuals, firms, governance, board, leadership. So we have a tremendous opportunity in strategic management to contribute to this, as I think the last panel was arguing. Now, meanwhile, because firms are kind of figuring this out and business schools are further up the chain figuring this out, the Leviathan has stepped back in. We thought the fall of the Berlin Wall, end of history, and then we had 9/11. And since that time, since 9/11, the rise of China, global financial crisis, COVID, the Leviathan is really active, has stirred, intervening on multiple dimensions. And it's basically about the distribution of the costs and benefits. On the one hand, it's across geography. Who's in, who's out, immigration, foreign investment, trusted capital. Who do we want? So geography is there's a spatial dimension to the distribution, and that spatial dimension matters. Countries are not going anywhere. I remember some decades ago, global strategy scholar writing about countries as anachronisms. I remember a CEO of IBM writing about the globally integrated enterprise, footloose and operating everywhere. That era is gone, and national security is back. Not only national security, but social security, especially as people like Piketty or Daran Ashimoglu at MIT remind us, the capital labor distribution of total income. The labor share in GDP has declined for the last 40 years as GDP has grown incredibly. The Gini coefficient is therefore much higher, and corporations and how they reward shareholders and top leaders is a major, major issue and leads to stakeholder conversations, say on pay in countries like Switzerland. And finally, there is a temporal dimension. So there's a cross-sectional dimension, a spatial dimension, and a temporal dimension on the distribution of the costs and the benefits. And the temporal dimension, of course, is about the future and what kind of discounting would be used. Finally, we agreed to have zero discounting for some climate reasons. If you have an NPV, if you have a discount rate of 10% in your spreadsheet after 20 years, everything doesn't matter. It's just unbelievable, from the mining industry to every kind of industry where, and so the question was why, under what circumstances might we have negative discount rates? Are there occasions when we would say the future matters more than the present? So we have the return of the activist state, which has made all these policies. For the geographic divide, there's both industrial policy and, of course, international policy on trade, on protectionism, on tariffs, but also on living wage, and what kind of, do we want food security, energy security, chip security, and data security, et cetera, et cetera. Another dimension of policy has been welfare policy, whether it is parental leave, family care, and then what kind of taxes do we want to abolish billionaires? And finally, environmental policy. So there are multiple dimensions of policy that the Leviathan wants to make and is making across, as Ronnie said, multiple countries. This is in the south in Brazil or India, but also in the north in Europe. It's in China, where the shared prosperity, the Jack Ma's and the Alibabas have been kind of told, you're not playing fair, so let the state come in. And as Rajshri was saying, statism, which was declining, is again on the rise. What about strategy? What are the implications for strategy? So essentially, strategy is focused on value capture for the most part and value creation to also a great extent. These are the primary dependent variables in both of these, in our field. What is the missing DV? Where can we go? This has been mentioned in the previous panels, is about value distribution. How do we address this? The good news is we need more, not less strategic management. So traditional value creation, value capture, we've talked about under a competitive strategy. And we had two big vectors, innovation and internationalization, for profitability and for growth and expansion. It is very clear that firms will also need to develop a contributive strategy. And we will have to learn how to integrate across these boundaries, whether it is home and abroad, or let's look at these boundaries, right? What do we need to, and Gautam mentioned power on the first day. There is always going to be power, both private power and public power. The question is not about the extent of the power, it is about the use of the power. Can firms and their leaders and their boards, each of us in fact has power, economic power as consumers. How do we use the power to better integrate these things, multiple things that we care about, which may be contradictory? So the different divides, how do we better integrate business and society, humanity and nature, present and future, home and abroad? Right? And there are 4 dimensions in strategy that every firm can play with. These are choices. They have to be coherent. They have to meet the cost of capital. As Ron said, it may not be about maximizing profits, but it has to be about generating profits that are above the cost of capital. These are the 4 dimensions. How do I compete? How do I contribute? What configuration? Where will I have my supply chain? Where will I get my energy from? Where will I keep my jobs? Where will I pay my taxes? Coca-Cola is being sued by the IRS now for transfer pricing. I work with Coca-Cola right now on a project on water stewardship. And again, going back to the previous panel, the demand is there. Coke wants to do better on all of these things. They want to have a contributive strategy on water, on plastic or sugar. Okay? And finally, the important one, coordination. The management of these things, as the previous panel talked about, the coalitions, it's going to be an ecosystem, whether you want green hydrogen or whether you want, in fact, self-driving vehicles. If we don't know how to relate to others outside our control sphere. So there are 4 dimensions for private policy. And there are many companies that are already engaged in this kind of contributive strategy. I'll just name one example. Maersk, this Danish shipping company, one of the largest, they chose in 2018 to go for zero carbon shipping. Last year, they had their first zero carbon ship delivered to them. It was a breakthrough. It was deep tech. They're using green methanol. They've ordered 25 ships. It is costly. There was a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, but the way they've done this and the fact they've done this, and meanwhile, of course, they still will use bunker fuel and diesel because this is the world we live in. We have to be pragmatic. Apple on neural match and child pornography, Tanishq, which is India's leading gold jeweler, the way they work with suppliers to upgrade the systems, create jobs, but making sure that the workers who are doing the gold jewelry, this is a very, very, hands-on, it's not an AI kind of job business. It may not provide a living wage. How to create that? Of course, a big story of Interface, the tile carpet manufacturer, many of you may know, Stella McCartney on animal welfare, fashion without animal cruelty. Multiple firms already show us the way. Now, the key thing, if we're going to reshape competitive strategy, we need to think about outcomes, not only output. Apple thinks about in the Apple AI, Apple Intelligence, the new Apple Watch feature that they offer is on mental health and emotions. We have AI, Felipe, but what we want is BI, beneficial intelligence. Companies like John Deere working on precision agriculture, this is using AI as BI. So we know that innovation can be targeted to outcomes and not just output. Importantly, on competitive strategy is going to be how we capture value. Initially, it was like how much value you captured, but today we ask, how do you capture that value and how do you distribute that value? There are three questions in strategy, not just one in terms of the performance. And there is a huge trade-off. There is a change in the way we think about how firms might be able to capture that value. Minimum means, efficiency, productivity, economizing, that was the way economics developed in the late 19th century. The first people who wrote the formal economics, Edgeworth, Pareto, Walras, who gave us a general equilibrium model, they created this idea of minimum means rationality as the rational criterion for economic action. Today, we want to complement that with minimum harm, not only minimum means. And this changes, Ron, the question of what is the new profit function? So if we want, can we have, Veet asked, how is the profit made? Can we integrate that into an economic model? Yeah, we just need to understand that there is a cost-harm trade-off. When George Stigler got the Nobel Prize for cost curves, Bill Nordhaus got his Nobel for cost harm. He was the first one to kind of model how the trade-offs were being made, right? And we need much more work in that. The profit function here is a very simple, so we know that lower the cost, greater the harm. Lower the harm, greater the cost. We want to minimize both of these, cost and harm. Can we change the profit function where we put theta, harm, into that profit function? And can we start estimating what does that look like? So same thing for Pareto optimality. Pareto optimality is actually Pareto efficiency. In the 1950s, we started calling it optimality. Pareto efficiency and Pareto optimality are two very different things. There's any number of points in a contract curve that are Pareto. Pareto is a good standard, it's a gold standard. But to call it optimality, we would have to have some moral ideas of what is fair. I encourage you to look at jungle Pareto or jungle economics. It's an equilibrium where power is used to exploit, and this is the Amazon worker versus Jeff Bezos. How much does an Amazon worker earn? And the key thing here is the invisible hand. What makes that equilibrium point is the slope of the price curve. The prices, as you know, are the invisible hand, but prices are not set in a Walrasian auction. They are created by the powerful. Can we move from a jungle Pareto to a moral Pareto? Philosophy can help us do that. Rawls tried, not completely. Kant tried, not completely. Smith tried. Today, we are in a much better position to help firms to come to a moral Pareto while meeting the cost of capital. Again, it's Ron's point about maximizing profit versus generating profit above the cost of capital. We can do that if we work with philosophers. I know my time is running out. Key thing, Jay, this is going to require new capabilities and new culture. So we can't do this with the same, we need moral reasoning. Claudine talked about that social choice. Bernice is both moral reasoning on the ends and on the means. Mobilizing collective action. Jürgen Habermas worked for almost 100 years trying to tell us, hey, we need to communicate. You cannot be an ideologue. You can be idealistic, but don't be ideological. And maybe people aren't ready. Be ready to compromise. We can't impose. So what is communicative rationality? And what is two-stage rationality? If Bruce is here, Phil Kitcher, Bruce proposes two-stage rationality. It's a fantastic, workable, concrete thing. Finally, marketing as shaping consumer preferences. Lennox was saying that where do consumer preferences come? Preferences are endogenous. Jim March was always saying that. Marketing is one way in which we can endogenize. What is thoughtful consumption, whether it's on social media or whether it is on the fast food or how much apparel or housing, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, there are lots of new areas for research in strategic management. It's incredibly, incredibly exciting to be in this field, in this moment, to be relevant, but to be also rigorous and kind of think about the role of business. The key thing is, it's not just the role of business. Normally we had business, society, and government as the triangle. we also need the academy to show up. I believe education will be way more important than regulation. We've spent the last century betting that regulation will be a great answer. I'm not sure it is. Well, this is what I want. And the last point I'd make is, MBAs as masters of better alternatives, not business administration. Thank you. Let's.
All right, let's get to some questions. What we'll do, Subi, please take a seat. We'll try to collect a bunch of them, and we'll do them in a very efficient manner. Let's get a bunch of quick questions, and we'll rack them up. Be as quick as you can, I know, so we can get to more of them. You want to run this mic? I see one over here in the corner. Do you want to run another mic? Over here? Oh, okay. Yep. Go ahead. Perfect.
Thank you so much. It was very engaging, interesting. Ronnie, I've missed something. It was not in your list of research questions. But if you want to do industrial policy, what about government capabilities? Will they be able to do? I think that it has to do with what you said, Rashri, the how, and you also, Subi, mentioned about capabilities. I don't think that several of those economies, like South Korea, they had technical people, and also they had some sunset clauses, right? They knew where to stop and when to stop, right? So they attracted good people, they had incentives, et cetera, et cetera. What my question is, what are the implications of that to our agenda? I see my students interested in those things, in working for governments, right? They could be some of those capable guys. Business schools, they have, customized programs with governments. So they teach leadership for, government leaders, and even consulting firms, they do a lot of work on this. So and I don't see much research in that area, right?
Okay.
How to create this kind of.
Good. Let's collect a few others. Rafaela? Yeah, now we can. Oh, maybe not.
No, now it's open. Okay. Thank you very much. This was super interesting. I just wanted to share a little bit of personal experience and some considerations. So about 2 years ago, I was serving as an advisor to a great prime minister in Italy, Draghi, who was conveniently booted out about a year and a half later. And I got myself negotiating for a big investment in the semiconductor industry that fell through when the government changed. And I was very upset about it. I'm very jealous of the CHIPS Act. Now, 2 years later, I see some things that concern me in the CHIPS Act. I see Intel being, in a crisis, and perhaps I wonder if these investments might have created additional distraction for this company. I see TSMC dealing with labor issues in transferring production here. And so the question that I saw only spillovers 2 years ago, and now I see frictions. So where I came with from that experience is that if you really want to do industrial policy in an activist way, you need to have such a profound understanding of the organizational dynamics and a real ability to understand and shape what these companies do. That I don't think, even in this government, Rani, I interacted with your team, they're excellent. It's really a lot to ask. And then I wonder, the companies that would want that are really the companies you would want to work with. There is adverse selection, and we're not Korea. So there is an issue of values and capabilities that surface. So I wonder if our role, maybe this is not the way to go. Maybe if you don't want to go all the way in this activist, because it seems really unfeasible to me, should we just take a step back and think about some underlying principles that I think, Rashri, you were mentioning? One, how do we make sure that we can guarantee that there is this match between skills, human capital creation, and what firms want? That's a huge topic where people who understand firms can really have a real impact, and trading is one of them. Two, how do we think about coalitions? Because a lot of what is happening is not one firm, it's coalitions of firms. So we have a lot to contribute there. And three, there is no evaluation. So I think that if we want industrial policy to work, we need to really think about how do we evaluate the effectiveness of these policies so that there is accountability as well.
Thank you. Minwan, go ahead. You got the mic. Or Jason could go, whatever.
Okay. Just really quickly, I think it's pretty impressive how many people in this room have actually spent a substantial amount of time working for government. This is a very pragmatic question directed to the panel, is that if you say want to go and work for the White House or some other agency, what are some of the ways in which you think about making that value proposition argument to higher administration, like deans, provosts, et cetera? Because that's an area where we've run into some issues in the past.
Thank you. Minwan?
Yeah, very quickly. So I grew up in a planned economy, and planned economy doesn't work for two reasons. One, the government cannot possibly have all the information of the market, and two, you cannot enforce on efforts, incentives and efforts. So I was in Seoul, Korea for the AIB conference, and I talked with many chip insiders in Korea, and including people from all over Asia. And the interesting conversation was when the US decided to have the CHIP Act. One, the US government doesn't know how to produce chips. Two, the US government doesn't know that the TSMC and the Samsung don't know how to produce chips in America. And three, they don't know how much incentive TSMC and Samsung have in producing the best chips in America. And so it's interesting how these things map to, the idea I grew up with, and I'm just wondering what are the thinking process in that.
Asim?
So this was a great panel. I guess the one pushback I would sort of offer is that I think we want to be, or I guess, thing I think we should be thinking about, right? I think all of these things didn't just come out of nowhere. And I think this connects to some of Subi's initial discussion about Polanyi, et cetera, right? We created these problems, right? The international business strategies we use right. So I mean, I 100% agree with Rajshri that open economic systems are the right solution, and I don't think activist states are the right solution. But I think the imperfections of those open markets are what led to this backlash against some of this. And I think I would like to make a plea for us to be. I completely agree with the idea that we need to be thinking about how policy translates into actual outcomes through the filter of strategy. And I have some work that does that. But I think the other interesting question that I feel like we're skirting around right now is the ways in which we firms, and I think Pete was talking about this, right? The way that firms are actually creating this conflict, creating these problems, and how should we be thinking, right? I mean, that's, I think, a whole research agenda that, which is not the same as saying, oh, let's understand how this ESG bullshit is like doing something, or if it's doing something, it's not. But whether, some of this other stuff, like the actual business models we're doing, maybe it is doing something. But, I think just thinking about that is something I would really like to see us do more.
Rashri, you want to start and we'll go down the line? Yeah. Yeah, that's it, right? Yep.
So a couple of things that I'd like to say out here. This actually harks back to the session on causal identification in many ways. I think that we ourselves tend to be very short-term in our focus on causal factors that may lead to current problems, or how current causal policies may lead to potential future benefits. So I think that a lot has been said about firms' short-termism. I think that we have not necessarily unpacked the role of policy in creating the problems that we currently attribute to firms necessarily. So a lot of the problems that we see today, you can trace it back, not just to firm actions of globalization, but also policy incentives that then cause the offshoring to occur, right? So why is it that a janitor in Ford was being paid $35 an hour in the 1970s as opposed to, so is that too much? I don't know. To what extent did labor costs contribute to the offshoring of jobs and the hollowing out of US manufacturing in the first place? We don't know. So these issues are some things that we immediately want to go to. This is what firms did. And this is why we're looking at it. But it's much more complex, particularly because policies have such an important role in guiding incentive alignment and then dictating which firms develop what capabilities. That's one thing that I wanted to say. The other was a little bit in response to what Subi said and things, right? So I think that businessmen, in particular, the productive, enterprising businesses, desperately need strategic management scholars to provide them the moral ability to stand tall and proud, right? 70% of the labor costs, of the costs of running a business are actually labor. So coming to value capture, 70% of it is being captured by labor. If you look at these giant profits that we say, oh my gosh, corporate profits are an all-time high, 50% of these profits go to pension funds or ways in which we're investing, you and I, right? So it is us that are getting the returns from these profits. We don't think about that when we want to create, oh, profits, businesses, bad. I think that strategic, and economists aren't going to do it. Political scientists are not going to do it. Sociologists are not going to do it. I think strategic management scholars need to give businesses the ability to say, morally, we are creating value. The only way that we can capture value is if we're solving problems for enough people that they believe that they want to buy our stuff because it's faster, better, or cheaper. And then there is another thing that I would like to ask us as to how much our own values dictate our own dismissal of first world problems versus second world problems, right? I mean, who are we to judge when and how a person that's making an honest living wants to spend their money? And yes, we can talk about education, we can talk about a lot of other systems that exist in society to help us think about what the moral values are. But let's give the business people a little bit better of a moral stand.
Subi, you can take us home and wrap up. And what I will do, fantastic questions. I'm going to follow up with people individually. Subi, you can say your last word.
I just say, there's a doctor who said, my patients come and say, doctor, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. If we could care more in each our own ways about this set of issues, and it goes to me, Rajshri, again, it comes back to having the rigor and the education, particularly of non-cognitive skills, caring, courage. We teach a lot about power. I wish we could teach a lot more about courage and caring. And I do believe that we can do that. If we cared a little more, maybe we'd have fewer of these calamities and controversies.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, we now come to the end of what I personally think was an incredibly productive and successful, for me at least, learned a ton. I've been a professor in strategy since 1980. So it's been a while, and yet, and so I thought I knew a lot until I experienced this conference and discovered how much I hadn't thought about and how much I still had to learn, which is, to me, the measure of a quality of experiences. It teaches me how much I need to learn. So thank you all for being here. I do have some little bad news. There is, in fact, an accident on I-80 eastbound, not westbound. So everyone going to the airport, it's about 7 minutes longer than normal. You still will make your flight, but we need to leave right now, okay? So thank you all for being here. Todd, do you want to say anything?
We'd love to
Well-
process it at the book, at the journal, other outlets, of course. These are important topics.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.